Okay.
All right, so good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's meeting of the Corporate Governance Committee. As before, this meeting is being broadcast live via the County Council website and will also be available for viewing after the meeting. Due to the current situation, all members of the Corporate Governance Committee and officers presenting today are joining online. Can I please ask that all officers and members mute their microphone until they wish or are invited to speak? And if you're able to use your video camera, please leave it on for the course of the meeting. Before we begin, if members want or officers wish to speak, please ensure that you use the little raised hand function, which is under the participants, rather than the chat line. So if you could do that, that would really help me, and I'll just take it in order. Before we begin, I'll ask members to introduce themselves, and I have received apologies from Mr. Kaufman, and thanks to Mr. Bill, who's acting as his substitute. So sounds like we've got a cuckoo in the background or something. So if everybody's muted, so if I could just go around in order, I will just call your name out if you just introduce yourself. So, Mr. Richardson, if you could just introduce yourself.
Thank you, Tom. Terry Richardson, County Councillor for Narborough and North Wexton and Vice Chairman of this committee.
Thank you, Terry. Mr. Bill.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. David Bill here, County Councillor for Hinckley.
Thank you. And Mr. Bolter.
Good afternoon, Chairman. Bill Bolter, County Councillor for Wixton South and Wixton West.
And if I could ask Mr. Orson to introduce himself.
Joe Orson, County Councillor for Melton Wolds.
And Mr. Old.
Ivan Old, County Councillor, Market Bosworth Division.
Lovely, thank you. And now I think the next person is Mrs. Wright. Is Mrs. Wright, Amanda Wright?
Yes, hello, Amanda Wright, County Council for Burbage.
Thank you. And finally, if we have Mr. Poland. Mr. Poland.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, members. James Poland, County Councillor for Syston Foss.
Thank you. And I don't see Mr. Sheehan. Is Mr. Sheehan with us this afternoon?
Yes, I'm surprised you can't see me.
Sorry. Okay, can't see you. I've only got 9 people on the screen. Right, fine.
So I'm Sean Sheehan, representing Forrester Measham.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Thanks for that. So the first item on the agenda is the minutes of the meeting held on the 24th of June 2020. I propose the minutes of the meeting are taken as read and confirmed as signed. Has anybody got an objection to that? No, so we'll take that as agreed. Item 2. I have no questions from members of the public. Item 3, questions asked by members under Standing Orders 7.3 and 7.5. I've received no members' questions. There are no urgent items. Item 5, does any member present have any declarations of interest in respect of items on the agenda today?
I do, Chairman.
Yep. Mr.
Inasmuch as item 9, the Ombudsman's annual report refers to cases in the Children and Family Service when I was still the Cabinet member for that. So I won't participate in that item.
Thank you. Thanks very much. So Terry Richardson, so you've got your hand up.
Come off. Just my normal one, please, Tom, of being a member of the Lloyds Bank Pension Scheme relating to, obviously, agenda item 11.
Lovely. Thanks very much. Right, before we move on to consider the substantive items on the agenda today, as a reminder, can I please ask members to allow officers to present their full report before seeking to ask any questions? as we're all joining online, to ensure everyone has the opportunity to speak, I propose once the officer has finished presenting the item, I will then open up for questions. And as I said before, if to indicate you have a question, please, if you would raise your hand on the electronic, a little yellow hand on that is under the participants option, and I'll call on you one at a time. So the first item we have is the, let me just have a look, is the risk management update. So that is on page 11 of the report. As part of the first risk management update, there will be a presentation on corporate risk 6.1 regarding the EU transition by Tom Purnell, Assistant Chief Executive, and Pat Clark, Assistant Director in the Environment and Transport Department, which will be loaded onto, well, we're hoping it'll be loaded onto everybody's screen and viewable on the webcast. Tom, will you present these slides? If I could ask you to put your slides up and do your presentation.
Yes, I'm doing that now.
Lovely, lovely. Just thank you.
Can you see that?
We can't. Yes, that's better. We can see you want to join the Teams meeting, but that's not the right screen.
Okay. Let me try that again. Sorry about that.
Oh, that's it. We can see it now. That's great. We can see that. Thank you.
Sorry, that took a little while. So I'll just load that up so it's on properly. So that should be a slide headed Corporate Governance Committee and the date.
It is. Yeah, it is.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Shall I start with the presentation?
Yes, please. Yep.
Thank you. Yes. I'm joined for this presentation by Pat Clark, as you mentioned, and he's going to pick up the transport issues in particular. So I'll be going through the slides and I'll hand over to Pat when we get to one of the slides on transport impacts. Oh. The first slide there really just reminds you what corporate risk 6.1 is. So that's around the end of the EU exit transition period, and the risk of there not being a formal trade agreement being in place between the UK and the EU and the implications of that. So the presentation sort of deals with that risk, and I think it's fair to say it also deals with other risks relating to EU exit, even if there is a deal, because there still may well be impacts of a deal depending on what the contents of that deal are. I thought it'd be worth just reminding the committee of the role of the County Council and of the Local Resilience Forum under the Civil Contingencies Act, and EU exit alongside COVID-19 and other incidents are treated as sort of incidents in that context. So the council is a category 1 responder, responsible for ensuring that it mitigates the impact of disruption to serve to its services on residents and communities, and we're also responsible for working in partnership with other responders, and we do that on a Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland basis through the LRF, the Local Resilience Forum, sometimes known as LLR Prepared. And throughout the presentation I'll be referring to the work that both the Council and the LRF are doing in relation to EU exit. A bit of context, and I'm sure members of the committee will be aware of much of this because obviously much of it's in the news, although perhaps not as much as it was a year ago because of other priorities for the media and government. So the EU exit transition period ends on the 31st of December, but negotiations with the EU about arrangements beyond then continue, and we're all waiting to see what happens in relation to those. The government has put in place a 3-stage border planning exit process, which takes some of the pressure off the 1st of January, I think it's fair to say. And I've sort of set those out on the next slide, so we can come back to that. In October, the government issued a reasonable worst case scenario document to LRFs to help plan for potential impacts. So that's not a prediction of what's going to happen. It's not the absolute worst case scenario. It's not the expected scenario, but it's a stretching scenario to help us plan for a reasonable worst case. And you may have seen that I think that document has been leaked to the media this morning. Actually, it's been covered in some of the newspapers, I think. The LRF has set up a strategic coordinating group, which is in effect a gold command group, which is now overseeing preparations for all of what it's calling winter issues. So that includes COVID-19, it includes EU exit, it would include flooding and storm type issues, for example, other flu issues, and indeed avian flu, which is something that we've just started to have to deal with in the last few days. And the risks relating to having a number of those incidents all happening at the same time, that's been exercised by the LRF, so that we've been able to sort of test our robustness around that and put in place measures to make sure that we've got the right capacity in place should a number of these things happen concurrently. And within the LRF, an EU exit group has been established with sort of full partner involvement, chaired by the Chief Executive of North West Leicestershire District Council. And then within the council, mirroring that LRF structure, we have a crisis management group chaired by the Chief Executive, which is overseeing all of those issues as well. And in the structure that sits beneath that, we have an EU exit group with all departments represented on it, which I chair. And I'm sure you'll be aware that on Friday, Cabinet received an update on EU exit issues and noted that update last week. So I wasn't planning to sort of read through these three, so they're there for you to see, but these are the three different stages of the border planning exit stages that the government has put in place. So some of those coming into being on January the 1st, then April and July, and obviously that's sort of subject to what happens with the negotiations that have hopefully been concluded fairly shortly. In terms of local resilience forum preparations, the LRF has developed a strategic risk overview, and it has identified a number of highest risks for the area. And by the area, I mean Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland. So a particular risk around impact on health and social care services, around staffing, and medicine and medical equipment supplies, and that would include PPE, for example, and also sort of business continuity issues and the impacts for local businesses. And I'll come on to some of those risks in a bit more detail later on. And a number of active work streams underway in that LRF work around communications, transport, which Pat will touch on, port health and trading standards issues at East Midlands Airport, business support, and the monitoring of impacts. And there's a tactical coordinating group reporting to the SCG. That's so tactical group reporting to the strategic group, which is helping manage these with the EU exit group, looking at issues in more detail. So the national reasonable worst case scenario, I mentioned that it was a set of planning assumptions, the stretching scenario, so I won't go over that first bullet again. It's the document's been provided to LRFs on a sort of a confidential, sensitive basis, notwithstanding the fact that it's been quite a bit of the information has been published in the press today. But what I've done is included there some examples of some of the key assumptions that we're needing to take into account when making our own local preparations. So these are the delays on delays in relation to freight transport, particularly in that should be the east of Kent, actually, not the east of our county, but particular delays down there which might have a knock-on effect in terms of the rest of the country, potential impacts on the supply of medicines and medical supplies, impacts on food and energy prices, and that could have particular impacts for the financially vulnerable, increased chance of adult social care provider failure, and potential of risks of protests and counter protests. And those are amongst the sorts of risks we've been looking at locally, just to test our preparedness for them. Within the County Council, we've looked at the key risks for the County Council and in terms of the services that we provide. So one of those is around traffic disruption at East Midlands Airport, and Pat will come on to that. That risk is not now considered one of the highest risks for the LRF compared with a year ago when it was, because of new circumstances, and Pat will explain that. And then those adult social care issues, which are obviously of key importance to the County Council. So I was going to then move on to each, to several key impacts, which I was going to talk about in a little bit more detail in terms of the nature of the risk and the action that's being taken to address that. And the first one's on transport. So I'll hand over to Pat at this stage to say a few words about this one.
Thank you, Tom. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Tom has highlighted, the risk that we've got in and around transport has been reduced from that of this time last year. Our main focus is in and around the airport and the 5 mile zone of interest. And it is around making sure that transport can move as freely as possible in that area. So as we have discussed, the risk we deem the risk to have reduced for a number of different reasons. One being the effect on airport transport due to the COVID-19 and the passenger numbers that we currently see going through the airport. But equally, we have seen an increase with regard to business continuity planning from the team up at the airport, who have put some very, very robust business continuity plans in place to utilise more of their car parking space for any build-up of traffic that may occur. That, in conjunction with the national new IT system that has been introduced with regard to managing border traffic and managing long queues at border control. So with all that said, what we have done is we have reviewed the plans from the past, or we're in the process of reviewing the plans from the past and making them more meaningful to this time, given the scenarios we're talking about. And equally, with regard to some of the network changes that have happened in that location. We have worked very, very intensely now with other agencies, as Tom has alluded to earlier on, and all agencies are now participating in making sure that traffic congestion in this area is a bare minimum. But with that said, we are putting contingency plans in place. Our contingency plans is to make sure we have some signs out on the network that can be implemented at short notice. Those signs will be placed the back end of December if no deal has been reached. So they will be ready for implementation when needed, and make sure that plan is robust. The anticipated cost of those signs being placed is 45,000, and we are in discussions making sure that cost sharing is part of this between all agencies involved. As you may be aware that the previous plans were estimated at 1.6 million, but as I said before, they are completely different plans to what we've got this time. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Pat. I'll move on to the next issue, which is around social care. Hopefully you can see that slide. I think the issue here is that there are some risks to the social care provider market as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the EU exit brings additional risk to that fragile care market. The risks relate, for example, to EU nationals potentially leaving the sector, challenges in recruiting new staff to the sector, which exist already, and also accessing medical devices and clinical consumables. And of course, those could be impact. Obviously, there's been increased demand for those as a result of COVID-19, but also there could be issues around the supply of those should there be congestion at the UK's ports. On staffing, that situation is being monitored. There's targeted recruitment activity underway and a workforce development strategy being prepared by by adults and communities. On medical supplies, we're more in the hands of central government here and DHSC, and there's work underway to mitigate any disruption. And as has been the case previously, there's a priority be given to the NHS, and we're still not clear whether the work extends into social care to the same extent. So that's something that we're looking at, and of course any increase in the cost of supply and any increase to the workforce could lead to more economic provision, and that will have a further impact on provider viability. Around border controls, the particular issues for the County Council relate to the Trading Standards Service. So the EU exit's likely to create new responsibilities for and demands on that service. There will be a new regulatory framework from the 1st of January, and that's going to have an impact on demand for advice and enforcement work. Could also be an increased flow of products which will require enforcement action as well. And it's expected that as certainly initially the focus will be on avoiding disruption and making sure that the products can still move into the country, and checks for safety and compliance may take a backseat for a while. So that will put additional pressure on the service. Those pressures are being assessed, and existing workforce priorities are being redefined to ensure that the key priorities can be addressed by that service. And it's just worth noting actually that the trading standards are sort of fighting on three fronts at the moment: COVID-19 and their enforcement responsibilities around that, EU exit, and also the avian flu outbreak in Melton, where trading standards have particular responsibilities linked to that as well. So they're facing some pressures at the moment. Legal services impacts, I think, around a number of issues, including the trading standards work, including around workplace rights, data issues, potential issues linked to asylum claims, as picked up in that third bullet there. All of those combine to mean that there could well be additional pressures, although there will be additional pressures, and the management team is monitoring that, planning for the work, and redeploying staff and taking on temporary staff as necessary to address that. So essentially being picked up through sort of mainstream business continuity contingencies there. Business readiness and economic impacts. So there's been quite a lot of engagement with businesses regarding the impacts of EU exit, but the evidence suggests that businesses aren't as well prepared as we would like them to be for the changes that are likely to happen. I think it's been really hard to get businesses to focus on this, given the other things that businesses are having to deal with at the moment, linked to COVID-19 and the general economic climate. There is work underway through the economic recovery cell that's been set up within the LRF, which is being led by the LEP to address some of those issues. And there's been a concerted attempt to get more comms out. Recently, there was some good coverage on Saturday, I think, in the Leicester Mercury, and there's going to be a dedicated sort of telephone contact work with businesses between now and around about Christmas time to encourage businesses to take the necessary steps around broader economic recovery. The sort of impacts of EU exit and the impacts of COVID-19 are being looked at and around, and work is underway, led by the LEP, to develop an economic recovery strategy and putting in place interventions to support sectors particularly affected. And work is well advanced within the council to focus on a number of key measures to respond to those impacts as well. Financial impacts. So the direct financial impacts to the council, I think largely for the reasons that Pat explained about the lower anticipated cost of measures to manage transport congestion around the airport. Those costs aren't as substantial as they were, but there are other ways in which the council's finances can be impacted. I've already explained some of the additional pressures on some of our services, which may require additional resources to be deployed. There are likely to be impacts on council tax and commercial income, and of course the council will be impacted on wider negative impacts on the economy should those be realised, and obviously any tightening of the national purse strings in response to the cost of the pandemic in particular. So some longer term implications set out in that final bullet there too. And then finally, the final slide, just in terms of next steps, clearly we're going to be closely monitoring what comes out of the national and EU negotiations. We'll update our risks and plans in response to that. The groups that have been set up are continuing to meet, and our frequency will be adjusted to reflect what's happening. We've put in place daily meetings from the 1st of January to manage the initial impacts. So I think those have been put in for 2 or 3 weeks to make sure that we're prepared and can respond to any impacts that might emerge from the end of the transition period. And obviously later stages of EU exit, later impacts are being planned for as well in terms of those later border planning stages should they remain, and also the broader economic recovery challenge. So Chair, that's my presentation, and obviously happy to take questions.
Lovely. Thank you very much to Tom Fennell and Pat Clark for a fairly comprehensive presentation, and certainly got plenty to think about, and it clearly has been thought about. Now I have some questions. The first question, if I could ask James Poland to ask his question.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you very much, Tom and Pat, for the presentation. It was really interesting. Just a couple of questions from me, if that's okay. Would the pressures that have been outlined in a no-deal scenario be likely to be ongoing ones, or are they ones that would be more upfront in the sense that they would hit us hard in the first few months, but then likely tail off as the months and potentially years pass, assuming we don't get a deal at a later point? And the second question for me, if it's okay, would be, do we have a record of which EU national staff, the staff that we've got from other EU countries, whether they've applied for leave to remain? And again, my thinking behind that is so that we've got an idea what the legal situation will be in regards to their right to work in the event of a no deal, or in the event of a deal that doesn't cover that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Poland. On the second one, can I just clarify, you're asking about county council staff or county council residents?
County council staff.
County council staff. Now, my understanding is that we do have a good understanding of that, and HR are sort of making sure that the rights of EU nationals and their employment situation is looked after in this situation. On the first question, I think the answer is there are both short-term and longer-term impacts. So, for example, if it turned out to be that there was major congestion in Kent, and that the motorway coming up from Dover towards London was completely clogged, and that could have an impact on food supplies, medical supplies, and other issues. And if that were the case, then that could have an impact on us locally. But I think the expectation is in terms of what the government's reasonable worst case scenario is that those queues in Kent will last for a matter of weeks or potentially months, but will abate over time as businesses become better prepared for the new world, if you like. But obviously, many of the longer term impacts will arise from just the general economic impacts of EU exit, and clearly some economists are predicting that there will be negative impacts, and our economy as the wider national economy will need to adjust to that, and we'll want to be supporting businesses to bounce back as well as they can.
Okay, thank you, James. If you would just take your hand down, that would be great. So next question is from Terry Richardson. Terry.
Thank you, Chair. Just one thing, I didn't know if we could get these slides off so the public can see the debate better, maybe.
Oh yeah, good
sensible.
those down, Tom, the slides?
Yeah, I'll do that.
I suppose my question's, Tom, you put a slide up early on which talked about food and energy prices, which was one that interested me. So on energy, I mean, clearly VAT is only charged on energy as an EU regulation. So have we been lobbying as a council or through the CCN to have that removed, because that would obviously help people considerably? And secondly, on food prices, it just said higher food prices, but I wasn't sure of the rationale. Because if you look at the tariffs claimed on food, so, you know, a typical example, green beans from Kenya, which are in every supermarket, there's a 28% import duty levied by the EU on them, which won't be levied going forward. So considerable amount of foods will go down in price. And of course, as a country, we now import less as a percentage than we did in 1928, which probably not a lot of people realise. So I just wondered why we thought there'd be an impact on food prices. And on the preparedness, I know we talk about the chambers of commerce, etc., but having spent 42 years in my working career doing international trade and trade finance, the people that would know whether or not companies are prepared and help them through it are the specialists at their own banks. Have we had any touch with them? Have we communicated with them to get their view on the preparedness of companies and how they're going to support them? Because, you know, most of the documentation these companies need is stuff that's been there since I started in the bank in 1972. It's just a lot easier because they're all electronic forms. So life should in some ways be considerably simpler through things like Cipro, etc.
Thank you, Mr. Richardson. Just taking those in turn, my understanding, I'm not aware that we've lobbied around VAT and fuel, but I can certainly check with colleagues whether that has happened, but I'm not aware of us having done that as a council. On higher food prices, I think this probably comes back to the question from Mr. Poland around short and longer term impacts. So I think what you described there around the impacts of a new tariff regime is probably a longer term impact. I think the food shortages and potential higher food prices would arise from the short term impacts caused by any disruption to the importation of food through the short channel ports, and that having a potential impact on supplies in the shops. And what the reasonable worst case scenario describes is a situation whereby there won't be food shortages overall, but there might be shortages of particular products, and that those will experience a potentially significant price rises, which could have a particular impact on more vulnerable groups. But again, I think that's one of those short-term impacts rather than necessarily one of the longer-term ones. And on the question about preparedness, I'd have to speak to colleagues who are more closely involved in the economic recovery work just to check whether that particular route has been investigated. But it sounds like a good suggestion, so I'll put that to them.
Oh, thank you, Terry. So the next question is from Mr. Bill. Mr. Bill, if you would like to ask your question.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Could I ask, these slides that we've seen this afternoon, then they aren't included in our pack, are they?
No.
No. Could they be sent out to us, please?
I don't have any problem with that. Happy for them to be sent out.
Right. What concerns me here is that leaving the EU was always going to be a gamble, wasn't it? And we were told everything was going to be better because we've got our borders back and we don't have to. Everything is going to be much better for everybody. But the trouble is, because of COVID, this country is on the floor, isn't it? With so many people facing unemployment in the new year, I just can't see how the worst case scenario that you've drawn up in these slides it reflects the reality of the situation. With so many firms going out of business, I think there was a reference in one of the slides to if the economy goes down or something. Well, to me, if people are out of work, then the economy is going down anyway. I find it hard to express my thoughts in a polite way, but quite frankly, the disaster that we're now going to face through leaving the EU was all utterly predictable. And I think the people who have led us down this way really should be held to account. If a group of individuals had done this much damage to the country in any way, they would have been prosecuted. But because it's the government itself that's done the damage, then presumably they'll just get praise heaped on them from somebody or other and they'll all get re-elected. But all I want to say on this is that I don't think that you've even touched the surface of the worst case scenario. I'm sorry to be pessimistic, but it doesn't look good to me. And I think that the worst case scenario really is a lot worse than has been painted in the slides that we've seen this afternoon. I'm sorry I have to say that, but that's I'm desperately hoping I'm wrong. I'm hoping it's all going to be fine and dandy next year, but I really do have my doubts. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Bell, for your thoughts on that. If you take your hand down a little, and that's great. Thanks very much. So clearly there has been a lot of work done. We will see. Nobody has a sight of prophecy, but it's certainly been a very, very tough year. And I think within reason, you've done everything you possibly could to prepare for what's about to land. But we'll see. There's always unexpected things come out. Now, we're now going to move on to the main report as set out on pages 11 to 32 of the agenda pack. If I could ask Neil Jones to do his presentation.
Not one person said I was wrong.
No, I don't think anybody. If I could ask Neil to do his presentation now, please.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. Can people hear me? Yes. I've lost. Can somebody nod that they can hear me? Yeah, okay, great, thank you. Sorry, I just lost a bit of sound there for a while. So yes, this is the main paper, agenda item 6. Excuse me, it's a risk management update, and that starts on page 11 of your pack. So what this report does is to provide members with information on a risk that's been added and a change to the definition of the EU risk, which has just been presented to you. It provides updates to each corporate risk. They're covered in Appendix 1 on pages 19 to 29. And of course, I will take any questions on those at the end of my report. It covers the Council's approach to managing the risk to achieving its recovery plans, and it also covers the Internal Audit Service's work on countering the risk of fraud, which is a sort of 6-monthly update. So into the report itself, the top of page 12 informs that the previous Ariva risk has been slightly amended but added back to the register, and also that the EU exit risk has been redefined. Paragraphs 7 to 12 in the report explain the work undertaken on the Council's approach to planning its recovery, and how any risks to achieving it are aligned to both the departmental risk registers and indeed, if needed be, escalated into the corporate risk register that this committee receives. And then the second part of the paper covers the work that my internal audit team has undertaken on counter fraud, and in a nutshell, this includes specific targeted COVID-19 counter-fraud audits, wider communication to all on potential COVID frauds, preparation for the next round of the National Fraud Initiative exercise, and we've submitted the relevant data, and I always take this time to remind members that includes details on members' allowances, which we have to supply, and we'll pick up any messages and any sort of data matches from February next year. We've updated our counter-fraud policies and strategies. There's a link to those there, should members wish to read them. Because of the concerns around types of COVID fraud, and some are spelled out specifically in paragraph 22, we've brought forward an update to our fraud risk assessment, and that's contained in Appendix 2, which is to be found on page 31. We've also updated information that we have to publish under the Local Government Transparency Code. And finally, if you blink, you may have missed it. Last week was the International Fraud Awareness Week, and we communicated a lot of messages in daily banners to staff on the Council's SharePoint. That's all I have to report, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Neil. Now, at the moment, I don't see. Has anybody got any questions? I don't see any little hands go up. No, it's.
Yes, I have, Chair. Yes, I put my hand up.
Right. Okay, please. Oh, yeah, sorry, Mr. Bolter. Yeah. Okay, Mr. Bolter.
Good afternoon, Neil. You've stole my thunder on one or two bits, but one bit that does concern me is the either split between the Reaver appeal between the county and the district, the county and the city, and the other one on the domestic care. It's going to be recommissioned in 2021. Now, what concerns me is the fact that on our weekly briefings we hear that our care homes are only 80% capacity. They're all struggling. The county council is making forward payments to them, try and prop them up. We've got one or two that are in difficult situations, being proved inadequate. So what is the county council doing about this? If the care homes do start closing, what are we going to do with our elderly residents? Where are they going to go? And I thought that would have been a very big risk on the corporate risk register, and I can't find it anywhere. But that's what concerns me greatly. If we say, you know, care in the community, well, we need extra people to do that, and we can't get any people now. And we can recommission that service anyway next year, unless it's been delayed. So our older residents are going to be really struggling. If we can't go into a care home, we can't look after them in the community. That to me is a very big risk to the county.
Thanks, Chair. May I come back on those?
Yes.
If I could take them in reverse order, Mr. Bolter. I think, without stealing Chair's thunder, the second question that you're asking, or series of questions, may well be covered off in the next risk that we're going to cover in the January meeting. So if I can just bear with me on that one. I missed your point on the Arriva risk. What you were querying on that?
It's the split between the county and the city. I understand the city now wanting to pay less for the Arriva case, which loads it onto the county.
Yeah, I don't know the exact figures. What I do know is that they're under, obviously, strict negotiation around that, and that's why it's been added back in terms of an upgraded cost to the county, or potential cost to the county. So I don't know the exact figure, but say that the due process has been followed to bring it back to committee's decision, committee's domain.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Bolter. So if you take your little yellow hand down, that would be appreciated. And the next question is from Mr. Old.
Thank you, Chair. Neil, I like your report. It's very comprehensive. It covers everything. I particularly focused on 1.5, 1.6 and 1.9 on pages 21 and 22. And in particular, the position of unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, where I know that there's already an overspend in the budget, and where the government, the Home Office, have made it very unclear how they're going to deal with the problems in Kent. But at a meeting that I had as chair of the East Midlands Migration Board with Chris Philp, the Minister, it would appear to me that the Home Office has a vested interest in bringing a mandatory situation about whereby, in order to relieve Kent, unaccompanied asylum-seeking children will be distributed region by region, and that could cause a cost of £100,000 per child who might come this way. Now, I think it's really comprehensive what you've done. It was very easy to read, but you would only need 10 children sent to Leicestershire to find you've got another £1 million overspend if that scenario were to occur. So what I'm interested in is, how frequently are these risks being reassessed? Is it almost continuous monitoring, or is it over, say, a 3-month period and then you review it? I know we've another meeting in January, but I couldn't pick up how the time frame was operating. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Old. to give you assurance, the risk processes are and procedures are that each management team, and in this case, children's management team, would review those risks on a monthly basis, and then we pick them up in my team to sort of amalgamate them together, ready for this committee. So the risks are within the domain of managers much more frequently than the committee sees them. So there's more of an update. And whilst I take the compliments, all of the detail that's recorded in those updates comes directly from the managers who are managing those risks. So that's their work there. But if I can give you that assurance, they are frequently monitored.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So the next question I have is Terry Richardson.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of very quickie ones, Neil, for clarification. The first one is 9.2, which is on the waste collection. Now, we're just interested in the bit we say all the recycling sites are open, etc., but it removes some operational flexibility to manage increased volumes or staff shortages. But the booking system is helping mitigate this. So I was interested in how a booking system is mitigating it, because presumably you've got people needing to book. You've then got staff resource in case they ring up to not be able to get the booking. You've got more people checking bits of paper when they arrive at the waste site. So I just wondered how that helped greater staff flexibility rather than it just being open and people turning up. And under 9.4, where we talk about climate change impacts, we're talking about reducing impact on council services, but there's nothing there about council costs. So if in looking at, I mean, one of the biggest risks we face as a county comes up every year is flooding, isn't it? So if we establish that flooding can only be remediated by major work, there is a massive potential cost to that, some of which comes to the county council, but we haven't mentioned costs in that risk.
In short, I can't really answer either of them, to be fair. I was going to say, is Pat still on the call? Is he still with us? I don't know whether Pat from ENT or he left.
I can have a go at the waste one if you.
I was going to come to you on the waste. Oh, on the waste one, Chris. Sorry, I thought you were going to come on the climate change.
Yeah. Well, I think what it's getting at, Mr. Richardson, is that in terms of managing the queuing system, is because it's an online system now, and you have to book a slot. And actually, it doesn't get, most calls actually aren't fielded by the call centre. About 97% actually goes through directly through kind of just online access, so you automatically book your own slot. And in terms of the savings, previously we had some extra costs built in around traffic management. But once you've got this kind of system of online booking, you don't need the traffic management, hence you can reduce the staff costs at the waste sites. I think that's what it's getting at in terms of that risk, in terms of the kind of the savings that it brings.
Could I just come back on that, Chair, if I may?
Yes, of course. Yes, please do.
It's just on that one, Chris. I mean, I've been in Norfolk in recent times, and all their waste sites are open, and they had major traffic management issues at their waste disposal sites. But since they've opened them 7 days a week, they've A, massively reduced the staff over there, and B, they have no queuing issues, which they had beforehand. So it would strike me that evidence from other counties shows that a non-booking system and letting people turn up actually achieves what we want and would actually save money on the booking system side. And has that been investigated fully? That's all I was interested in.
I suppose it would go back to, I'm pretty certain kind of pre-COVID there were queues at certain times, probably on Sundays or whatever, at certain waste sites. And I imagine that bringing in the online booking system has got rid of those queues and has enabled a more even flow of people using the sites. I can see Pat is actually kind of online. He's probably better equipped to answer this than I am.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Yes, Chris, you are absolutely right. Before the booking system was in place, there was queues at these sites. The booking system is one way of helping and aiding, trying to deal with the restrictions that need to be put in place with regard to COVID-19 and social distancing on the site whilst people are using the site, along with trying to manage that flow of waste into the site. And I think the booking system also gives us an opportunity for it to be more predictable. We could take on board the comments that's been made here today and take them through the next risk review, if that's okay.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Neil, sorry, did you want me to pick up the one about the environment?
If you have anything to add, please, Pat, that we
just again to take on board the comments that's been made, and we will reflect that. Of course, the changing environment will have financial implications to it, and we just need to make sure that we're managing them through the risk register.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks for those answers. I cannot see any other. I can't see any other questions. Hands raised there. So we will go on and moving the various recommendations.
Chair, just before we do, sorry, we normally bring to your attention potential risk for the next committee.
Oh, yes.
So Mr. Bolter's question was very relevant, or questions were very relevant, because in reviewing the register this time around, we looked at risk 7.3, which is about the social care market. And in terms of that, we thought that would be a good risk to ask the director to report on next time.
I think that's a good idea. I just going to come to that. Thank you for that. So, to the recommendations that are set out on page 16 of the pack, regarding the recommendations as to I recommend the committee is asked to approve the current status of strategic risk facing the county council. I'm happy to move this recommendation. Can I have a seconder? Have we got anybody who wants to say yes? Thank you, Mr. Bill. Oh, thank you, Terry. Thank you. And can I take it there is agreement and there is no dissent? Yeah, fine. So I take that as an agreement. Regarding the presentation recommended, we've just heard it has been proposed that we have a presentation as outlined in risk 7.3 on adult social care. Can I take that as agreed? Yeah, there's no dissent. With regards item C on the recommendation, can we note that the committee notes the updates regarding the recovery planning on COVID-19 and the counter fraud initiatives? Can I take these updates as being duly noted? There's no dissent there. Thank you. So I take that as agreed. We now move on to the external audit, item 7, external audit of the statement of accounts, annual governance statement and pension funds are set out on pages 3 to 68 of the supplementary agenda pack that was sent earlier. Now, before we start, I'm wondering if the head of finance, Nick, would like to make some initial comments on this.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, everybody. I don't intend to say much in relation to this report, as John Gregory and Avtar Sahal from Grant Thornton are here to talk you through the auditor's report in detail. Just to say, though, there are a few loose ends to tie up, but the key thing for me is that the overall conclusion is that there are no material errors to report. There are two specific recommendations that have been made. One is in relation to the timing of schools' bank account reconciliations. This is assessed as having a low impact on control systems and is easily addressed. The other is assessed as having a high effect and arises from the outcomes of the IT audit of the financial systems. Most of the issues raised in this recommendation will be directly addressed by the move to Oracle Fusion as part of Fit for the Future. We'll work with IT colleagues to ensure that appropriate measures are put in place to address the issues that have been raised. There's also a section in this report on the recommendation from the National Audit Office Guide for audit and risk committees, specifically around sort of financial reporting. The questions it raises are similar to issues raised by the external audits and are covered in their report. But briefly, it focuses on valuations, how the county council values its assets, completeness of liabilities, how the county council continually assesses its liabilities, such as uninsured insurance claims and bad debts. Going concern, especially in light of COVID, the actions taken to ensure that the county council can continue to operate effectively for the foreseeable future, and events after the reporting period. Again, well, these are reported in note 7 to the accounts, and again, in particular, focus on the impact of COVID, which obviously hit right at the end of the last financial year. The wider implications of the National Audit Office Guide for Audit and Risk Committee will be picked up by Neil in the next agenda item. So going back to the audit, overall, obviously, the outcome is very pleasing. COVID has presented additional challenges this year, with interaction needing to be undertaken remotely. And this has led to additional costs for Grant Thornton, leading to them requesting an increase of 15% on the agreed audit fee. And just finally to say, reports back to me have been very positive about the way that the audit has been undertaken, and the engagement between LCC finance staff and Grant Thornton has been very good. So I would just like to thank John, Avatar and their team for that, and through you, Chair, hand over to them to talk you through their report.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. I'll invite John Gregory and Avatar Sohill from Grant Thornton to present the item. So over to you, John and Avatar.
Thanks very much, Chair. Yeah, you'll be pleased to know that I don't propose talking you through every page of the report in detail. There is much in there that is content that we're obliged to put in there as a result of auditing standards. But I will just try and add a little bit to what Nick has said by way of sort of flavour and context. So yeah, overall, good set of accounts for both the main county council and for the pension fund. Remembering that we actually are doing two separate statutory audits here for the two bodies, and very few amendments based on the work that we've done, and yeah, certainly nothing that has any impact on the bottom line. So that's great. It was a sort of planned decision, jointly agreed between ourselves and yourselves, that we should start the audit relatively late this year, and that was due to the expected timing of the Oracle major upgrade. And obviously things have changed in that regard since then. But the fact that we did start late means we are also sort of finishing late, very much up to the wire. You'll have seen from reading the report that it does record the fact that quite a lot of the work was still outstanding, ongoing at the time that we drafted the report. Some of it has now been finalised. There is still quite a lot that is going on that we will need to pull together in the next few days. The good news is that there are still no additional findings that we need to report that have cropped up since we wrote the written report. I'm keeping my fingers crossed that there won't be any more as a result of the remaining work that we've got to pull together. I am conscious that we have got a huge amount to get through in the next few days, and we will do our utmost to do that. I wanted to mention particularly the form of opinions that we are giving on both the county council and the pension fund. You'll have seen from the report that our opinions are including what's called an emphasis of matter paragraph. And I just want to make sure you appreciate that an emphasis of matter is not a qualification of the accounts. It's not a bad mark against your name. All that an emphasis of matter does is simply to draw the reader of the accounts' attention to something in particular in the accounts. And in this case, what it's drawing the reader's attention to is the statements that you have made in the accounts about valuation uncertainty. The fact that at 31st of March 2020, obviously we were in a very uncertain time due to COVID, there was very little activity actually going on in markets for buying and selling property, and therefore the valuations of property at that time, whether it's the county council's own sort of operational and investment property or the property held by the pension fund, those valuations were subject to a statement of material uncertainty by the valuers themselves. So all that we're really doing is just drawing the reader's attention to the fact that material uncertainty exists. Nothing we can do about it, and that same emphasis of matter is included in the accounts of the vast majority of local authorities and indeed lots of other types of organisations this year. You'll appreciate that as well as giving our opinion on the accounts, we also have to give our view on your arrangements for value for money, the value for money conclusion. And you'll have seen that we are proposing an unqualified value for money conclusion once again. We did particular work around the risks to your financial sustainability, not just arising from COVID, but for the risks that existed before that. And I think if I can summarise our view, it's probably that you do face some significant challenges in future years. Which they were always there, but they've probably got worse as a result of COVID. So there will be some difficult decisions for you to take to balance the books in future years. On the other hand, I take great comfort from the fact you've got a very good track record of actually managing your finances and balancing the books. And also, I take comfort from the level of balances that you're actually holding going into this slightly more difficult period. And I guess the other thing to say is it's very difficult for you to know exactly how big the problem is that you're facing at the moment, because there is so much uncertainty around future levels of government funding, whether we're talking about the wider sort of financial settlement position in future years, or whether we're talking about specific funding that may or may not be made available to help with the additional costs and losses of income arising from COVID. Finally, Nick mentioned the additional fees that we've asked for, and I do know that some of you appreciate a good discussion about audit fees. Just to say that we have actually found that the amount of resource that we have had to put into our local government audits this year, they've actually been taking us about 40% longer. It's a combination of additional work that we're actually having to do because of COVID. So it's kind of revisiting the planning processes that we've been through. It's doing additional work to check the veracity of information that we're being sent by people who are working remotely, etc. So it's partly that, but I think the lion's share of it is actually just the impact of remote working, meaning that everything is taking longer. It's amazing how much difference the lack of sort of informal contact, the ability to just go and tap somebody on the shoulder, sit down with them, view their screen or whatever, is actually is making. So that's the reason for that increase in our costs of 40%. And we were not at all comfortable with the idea of trying to recover all that additional cost from you, but we felt that it was reasonable for us to ask you for 15% increase. So that's kind of less than half of the additional costs that we are facing. I think that's probably all I need to say at this stage. You have got the draft letters of representation in your packs as well, which they are a routine part of the audit. It's basically you telling us that you've given it your best shot in terms of the accounts preparation. Sometimes there are situations where we ask for specific representation, so additional things to be put in those letters to cover off particular issues. There's nothing like that in this year's letters. They are just the standard ones that we ask for from all of our clients. Okay, I'm quite happy to take any comments or questions.
Thank you very much, John. That is reassuring talk. Certainly there are many challenges facing us, and I think it would be fair to say that all members are very aware of the challenges we face going forward. We've had a number of briefings on it. So my first question is from Mr. Richardson. If I could ask him to ask you a question, Terry.
Thank you, Chair. I wasn't going to ask a question, but John forced me to just then when he said about the fees and people ask questions, so I felt honour bound. So I hope John will forgive me. But so there are 2 points there. Does that imply then that Grant Thornton have no business interruption insurance to cover increased costs arising out of a situation like this? And secondly, one probably for Chris Tambini or whoever's on is, does our contract permit those additional costs to be charged to us through no fault of our own?
In fact, I can hopefully deal with both of those issues. Although you might want Chris to validate what I say rather than just taking my word for it. There is no. I mean, we did not suffer a sort of business interruption as such, and there is no insurance cover available for this scenario. Otherwise, obviously, yes, we would have we would have claimed it. In terms of the sort of contractual position, you've got to bear in mind that the way this works is that our contract is actually with Public Sector Audit Appointments Limited rather than directly with yourselves, and the way that all variations in audit fees that we request are dealt with is that we have a discussion with yourselves about them in the first place, but then they have to be formally approved by PSAA Limited. Once that discussion has taken place, it's down to them within the terms of their contract with us in terms of whether they think it's reasonable. We have had discussions with them about this scenario that we're in at the moment, and they believe that the sort of levels of increase that we're talking about are actually more than reasonable, as in better than reasonable, as in we are being very fair with yourselves.
Okay, thank you very much. You made it sound, John, as though you were giving us a 25% discount rather than a 15% increase to 111,000.
Well, that's what my training does for me.
All right, exactly. Right, next question. If I could ask Bill Bolter to come forward with his question.
Thanks, Joe. Terry's really dealt with that because I'm always keen about the increase in costs and trying to keep the costs down. Has that been negotiated, that 15% increase? I mean, personally, I wouldn't accept it, but that's just me. I would have negotiated that down. Have we tried to negotiate that figure down at all? Or are we just rolling over and accepting it?
Shall I try and answer that? We've had some initial discussions, but we haven't done the proper negotiation. So clearly we will be seeking to negotiate that figure down. And I suppose if I start the negotiation now by saying that's higher than some of our social care providers asked for during the depth of the pandemic, it might be a bit of a starting point that we'd be looking to get a lower increase. But we are going to be reasonable. We do accept there clearly have been high costs for everybody during this period, but we'll be reasonable. Can I ask a question?
Please,
sorry, Joe, in this unprecedented time, we should all take our own cuts for all the businesses. We've all had to suffer in business, and unfortunately, we can't pass our costs on. So we have to absorb those costs, and it's very painful to do so, but we have to do that. We just can't pass them on. And whereas the auditors seem to be able to pass their costs on and without any sort of qualms, shall I say.
Well, whilst I wouldn't want to get too inflammatory, I would point out that local authorities do at least get some additional funding from central government as a result of the spending pressures arising from COVID. Whereas we did actually try going down that route on behalf of the whole audit regime, but unsurprisingly, it came to nothing. Because I mean, in all seriousness, we would much rather this had been dealt with as a sort of audit regime wide issue. And you know, there could have been some arrangement through PSAA to sort it without us talking to individual authorities.
Thank you, Bill. Chris, please. You had a question you wanted to ask.
Yeah, I mean, if I start by just thanking John and his team, because I think you know it has been difficult circumstances, and I think the audit has gone very well. So just a thank you. If you could pass it on to the rest of the audit team, John, that'd be great.
Yeah.
But my question is, we're clearly pleased with the lack of any qualification in terms of the audit, but just in terms of VFM, I'm kind of interested to see what the picture is looking like elsewhere. Kind of what proportion of other audits are getting qualified for VFM, given what we're hearing in the press about the financial sustainability of lots of other local authorities?
I mean, I don't have any sort of up-to-date figures for exact percentages this year, but certainly the number of qualifications is increasing as a result of the financial sustainability issues, and you'll also appreciate that there is one authority down in London which has recently received a report in the public interest as well, which was primarily on the back of its financial position and some governance issues related to its financial position. I don't know why I'm not naming Croydon, but yes, it's the London Borough of Croydon. So if anybody wants to read that one, they're more than welcome. But yeah, it's an issue which auditors are obviously very, very wary about at the moment. But at the same time, we're trying to be sensible and differentiate between those of the Croydons of this world that really are very much on the edge and kind of in the same place as Northamptonshire were, with those others. I mean, obviously there's a broad spectrum, but we still very much see yourselves as being at the sort of safer end of that spectrum. As I've already said, it doesn't mean you're not facing the challenges ahead, but they're just that bit further away, and you're that bit better placed in terms of actually dealing with them.
Thanks very much. Thank you, John. I think I cannot see any other questions here, so we'd move to the recommendations, and we are recommended to approval of the representation letter in Appendix B regarding the main account, and approval of the representation letter re the pension fund in Appendix C. And I would propose that we minute that, and I propose we recommend it. If I could have a seconder for that. Thank you, Ivan. And all those in favour? All those in favour. That's everybody. I'll take that. That's everybody. Thank you. That's unanimous. As far as the report is concerned, we are asked to note it. I'll take that as agreed from everybody. There's no dissenters. All right. I thank you very much, John, for coming and presenting today. Appreciate it. So we now move on to item 8, which is an update on the application of the National Audit Office Guide to Audit Committee on Financial Reporting and Management during COVID-19. I'm going to invite the Head of Finance, Nick Walsh, to ask him if he would like to just make any initial comments on it.
To be honest, I think that the elements that I was going to pick up, we've picked up in the previous item in terms of the financial recording aspects of the recommendations. So I think Neil will probably pick up the rest of them.
Thank you. So if I could ask Neil, Head of the Internal Audit and Assurance Service, to present this item for us.
Yes, thanks again, Chair. This is a follow-up report to a report that was taken to committee or brought to committee in July this year. And the National Audit Office are obviously the government auditors, and they see a lot of prominence in the role of audit committees and importance. And they set about recognising all of the change and impact that was happening during COVID, about helping audit committees through that and being able to set some challenging questions for them to be able to raise of officers and other people. So the guide came out in June, reported in July, and then we said we'd bring something back for this committee. So the guide covered off 3 areas. Nick has covered off the financial reporting element in the early report on the statement of accounts. I'm just going to give a very brief update on the annual report, the control environment and regularity of expenditure. And what I've done is attach a further copy as an appendix of the NAO guide to that, which contains all the questions. So in terms of the annual report, the guides recognised how it is a key mechanism for transparent disclosure of performance and how that would be impacted on during COVID-19. So in my research, what I've identified is that it's currently or soon to be released the Council's full annual delivery report and the performance compendium. So that's an annual exercise, and it's just coincided with this committee. So it's been through Scrutiny Commission in November, Cabinet last week, and now it's going to be considered by County Council on 2nd of December. This year's annual report obviously focuses a lot on what happened during 1920, but also picks up a great deal of how the council responded in terms of its COVID response thereafter into 1920. So in paragraph 7, I picked through the report and just put some bullet points in there to show how the council has identified how it's responded across a range of responses such as LRF, training standards, etc. So I'm not going to dwell on those. The annual performance compendium has also obviously tried to reflect changes in the council's performance that were impacted by COVID, and there are certain recognitions of that, certainly in terms of unemployment and helps to boost the economy. So it links across also to the council's risk register, which obviously this committee has a full impact in, and it refers in fact to the corporate risk that the corporate risk register includes. And then finally in the performance compendium, it talks about the references to other reports and financial indicators that are going through, and they'll be in the statement of accounts. There's also an annual report published, a statutory report by the Director of Public Health. Obviously, given the current circumstances, government have allowed that to be late, so we're expecting that to be early 2021. So in conclusion on reporting in general to stakeholders and the public, I conclude that the council has been very transparent in how it's reflected its response to COVID. Financial reporting, as I said, Nick mentioned it earlier. The control environment is an element that I've been involved in and my internal audit team. Certainly, we brought to the committee's attention back in June, I think, and then July, how the audit team has been at the forefront of putting itself out there to ask managers to identify changes in controls, discuss them, and then we can keep a note of them and make sure that they are either changed back should things need to change, or kept there and managed as would normally be. So I've put in paragraph 17 at some start of some specific questions from the guide, and you can see that the report shows that we are able to respond yes, how we responded back in terms of those. The IT services is a specific area within that about control environment, and IT has been obviously key in terms of its response and how it's helped staff and members of the public to be able to continue during the COVID process. we did some specific, or we continue to do some specific control environment work on IT, and that's proving to be very worthwhile. So that, I think that's all I said on the control environment. And then regularity of expenditure. We'd need to do a little bit more work, I think, on, there were changes to procurement regulations to allow quicker procurements to during the real crisis area. So I've agreed with the Director of Corporate Resources to be able to continue to do some work on that. But in terms of other areas, we've reviewed, I think it was mentioned earlier on about payments to providers. We've covered off things like that. And whilst yes, some of the areas were new, and they wouldn't be considered normal. They've been approached with a full risk basis that way. So I think it gives, in terms of, I've not seen other organisations respond to this report. I think it's a reflection on good governance for the County Council to be taking what the National Audit Office have put forward and then taking back to its audit committee a response to show how things are progressing. So that's all I have to say on the report. It's for information, really. Willing to take any further questions. It's likely that I'll probably bring some more information back after we've concluded our work on procurement.
Okay, thank you very much, Neil. That's a fairly comprehensive report, shows how you've adapted to the COVID crisis and what measures you put in place. Now, I have one question, if I could ask Sean Sheehan to ask his question.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, Neil.
Hello.
There's quite a bit in the report about procurement. So page 63, procurement rules, new supply chains created at pace, not allowing for complete risk assessments, etc., etc. I just wondered if there's anything that's caused you concern with procuring things like PPE, for example, any issues about overpayments, non-delivery, or the government getting into trouble for finder's fees and such things like that. Can't imagine we'd be involved in anything on that sort of scale, but I'd like to know what you've made of it so far.
From an internal audit perspective, Mr. Sheehan, I just mentioned that is an area where we haven't really picked up on. We were waiting to do some reviews of the due diligence undertaken in the procurement element, so I can't report back on any findings on that at the moment.
But I do take assurance that you are going to be looking into it.
Yeah,
so
sorry, I hoped I'd explain that, and it is. I think your page numbers are slightly different to mine. But could you give me a paragraph number? No.
4.8 and the box previous page 19.
Oh, sorry, are you looking at the actual guide itself?
Yes, I'm picking up from that.
Okay, sorry. Within my report, there is a specific reference to, and I'm just trying to scan down and try and find it now, but there is a specific reference under regularity of expenditure. Just bear with me.
I saw something on page 36, but
right, you probably beaten me to it there. But what that's asking is that we would agree to pick up the due diligence work around procurement in the next sort of cycle, so I can report that back to the January committee.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry, I understood now. I think we were talking about different documents.
Thank you, Mr. Sheehan. Okay. So I can't see any other questions. So we now moving to the recommendation. The committee is asked to note the attached reports and provide any comments. Well, it's a very comprehensive report. It shows exactly what we've done. Can I take the report as noted? Members agreed that all comments will now be captured in the minutes in the usual way. So I take that as agreed. That's fine. So that is agreed. So we now move on to item 9 on the Local Government and Social Care Ombudsman Annual Review 2019-20, an update on the complaints and freedom of information requests as set out on page 77 to 118 of the agenda pack. Now, we have with us Lauren Haslam, Director of Law and Governance, and Simon Parsons, Complaints and Information Manager. And I will pass over to Lauren and Simon to ask them to present their report. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So this is an annual report to the committee providing content on the County Council's annual review letter from the Local Government and Social Care Ombudsman, as well as brief updates on complaints handling and freedom of information handling through the year. So in 2019-20, 75 complaints and inquiries were received by the Ombudsman, and that's a slight decrease from the previous year. On page 115 of the papers, Appendix C shows that equates to 10.6 complaints per 100,000 residents that have cause to escalate to the Ombudsman. And that puts us in that indicator in the upper quartile against statistical neighbours. Decisions were made by the Ombudsman on 72 complaints during the year, and of those 23 were subject to what they call their detailed investigations. That's up from last year in the numbers that they were choosing to investigate, and that really is indicative of a wider trend of the Ombudsman nationally, that they are looking to undertake more detailed investigations than perhaps previously. Of those investigated, 78% were upheld for last year. Again, that's quite a bit up from the year before, and does put us slightly above both the national average of 66% and indeed statistical neighbours at 71%. There's a couple of things worth saying on the uphold rate indicator, because as I say, those figures do look high, both our own and nationally. It's worth just being clear that that figure only looks at the detailed investigations undertaken. So one of the ways that the Ombudsman report is that any complaints that are looked at an assessment stage, and where the Ombudsman looks at the council's response at the local resolution and decides that they're unlikely to find fault with how they've acted, are recorded again as an outcome category of no further action. So although their base, the Ombudsman is effectively saying, I don't think there's any fault here, it doesn't get reflected as a no fault found. So by default skews those figures slightly higher than might otherwise be the case. The other area is that the uphold rate includes cases irrespective of whether they were actually resolved locally before they went to the Ombudsman, and where satisfactory remedies were put in place. And during 2019-20, 2 of the 18 cases that were upheld, the Ombudsman noted that the council had resolved locally, and the Ombudsman had nothing further to add. So just important to say they're not automatically cases where the Ombudsman were critical of how the Ombudsman had handled the complaint. In keeping with previous years, detail on all of the 18 upheld complaints is set out across pages 79 to 83. I won't go through all that detail, but just to say that this year, to hopefully aid members, I've looked to group those by area, so that will hopefully bring out any trends. The one obvious area to note within those cases is the number of SEN related cases there, with 6 upheld complaints and significant levels of financial redress through the year. Other areas are in line with normal levels, so that's the area I would probably highlight. No public reports were issued last year, but as I say, there was a significant rise in the financial settlements, up significantly to around 30,000 from around 1,000 last year, and that's chiefly driven by the education complaints, which can be quite costly depending on long periods of children outside of education.
Yeah, that's lovely. Thank you.
The majority of those settlements were approved by the Director of Law in line with the delegated powers, with one case approved in consultation with the Chair as over the £5,000 limit. In terms of general complaints updates, members will be aware that there's 3 separate annual reports presented into the Scrutiny Commission and respective social care, Children's and Adults Overview and Scrutiny Committees. And indeed, this year, an additional report went to Environment and Transport Scrutiny and Overview to allow for consideration of two increasing trends in that area around transport related complaints, which saw an increase, and indeed wider highways ones. The general trend across the last 3 years is upwards, with a 39% increase in complaints over the last 3 years. And that really reflects the national picture and pressures on some services. Again, transport, SEN are two that stand out in the last year. Positively, response times to complaints is still very positive, with 83% of stage 1 complaints responded to in 20 working days, and actually that increased from last year. And only 9 complaints were outside of the 65 working day policy maximum. Paragraph 26 in the report sets out some good examples of some system-wide improvements during the year and just highlights some of the ways that we achieve learning through the complaints process. The final section of the report focuses on FOI and environmental information request handling. And I guess the primary function here is timely and appropriate consideration of those requests. So really this report looks to provide assurance around that. So again, in 2019-20, 983 requests for information were received. 88% of those were responded to within the statutory timescale of 20 working days. Up 6% from the previous year, and very close to the target suggested by the Information Commissioner's Office of 90%. And in particular, the final quarter saw particular success with 98% achieved. Bringing us right up to date, inevitably the pandemic pressures have seen some pressure on response times and freedom of information. The Information Commissioner's Office has recognised that would be the case and have been clear that they wouldn't be holding authorities to the same degree of account around that, recognising those wider pressures. Nonetheless, those response times have remained reasonably healthy at 82% in the year to date. And indeed, for the most part, the 69% of those requests are responded to in full and 84% in part. The only other thing of note there is just to say that there's been a very low level of requested internal reviews, just 3 this year, reflecting the fact that those responses are for the most part full and all very clear in the reasons why information cannot be given. And at the time of the report, no adverse decisions from the Information and Commissioner's Office around FOI related themes. That concludes my report, but very happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Simon. Very comprehensive report again. I have Mr. Sean Sheehan would like to ask a question. Sean, if I can invite you to ask your question.
Yes, Simon, interested to see the complaints and the substantial nature of the complaints, I should say, in the SEND area, and the fact that we've had an Ofsted report about the council's SEND provision. I just wonder if we should be looking at these complaints in with the action plan that we'll be drawing up in response to the Ofsted report to see what we can learn from that. Chair, I mean, your hands on that one. I don't know where to take this one, but I think that scrutiny ought to be having a look at it somewhere along the line. Maybe Simon could give me a bit of guidance on that.
Yeah, I think, Simon, I'll draw you back in there. I mean, this is subject to scrutiny, is it, or is it not? I thought it had been through scrutiny already.
So, to my knowledge, I haven't specifically been involved, but the SEN improvement plan has certainly been before the Children and Families Overview and Scrutiny Committee earlier in the year. The Director of Law and Governance may be able to add more to this. I can see that she's has a hand up here.
Yep. Okay, so I will invite Lauren Haslam, if I may, to make a comment if she is happy to do so. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, naturally, like the committee, I think Simon and I both share concerns in relation to the number of SEN-related complaints that we've had over the last 12 months. we use complaints, I suppose, to learn and to improve practice. And colleagues in the Children and Family Service, I know, are very actively engaged in addressing this through the introduction of a new case management system, which provides more real-time tracking for individual pupils, which will be a really key way of ensuring that we don't have these gaps in provision for children, and particularly those with SEN, where the Ombudsman take naturally a very dim view of children with special educational needs, missing education. So there's this case management system, a sort of restructuring going on of the service to provide a greater level of oversight and management of these cases. Sort of system review, really, as well as some closer liaison between the different sections within the Children and Family Service, so the admissions team, the inclusion team, the SEN team, to really try and tackle this sort of case to avoid these happening in the future. So in some ways, naturally, it is disappointing that we've had this number of cases and this level of complaint. But I hope that this is a one-off, if I can put it that way, and that next year the level of complaints will not be anything like at the same rate as we have seen over the last 12 months. So it's important, obviously, that those issues are picked up, because for each child it is a significant event. Just a few words really in relation to the awards that have been made. The Ombudsman operates a tariff type system for these sorts of cases, and for children who have special educational needs, the tariff is higher, as you'd expect, because the cost of provision is higher. So there is a sort of set amount per month or per week of education that is missed, and the awards that are made reflect that. They're calculated by the number of weeks that a student might have missed education against the weekly tariff that the Ombudsman operates. So that's really how the system compensates for the education that's been missed. Hope that's helpful, Chair.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lauren.
Yes, so Chair, I think we ought to be seeing this in scrutiny. We ought to not simply let it stand as it is. We're getting an action plan to do with the Ofsted report, and this should be picked up as a contributing element to that. And yes, if there's an action plan, if there's steps been taken already to deal with the kind of complaints that we've been having, let's hear about it. Let's have it scrutinised. But we can't really leave that out of any action plan scrutiny. I think we need to have it in there.
Thanks. I think probably a recommendation from you to the Scrutiny Commission would help, because they're going to pick their agenda. But I think I think it's been acknowledged it's an area that does need focus. I don't think it's going to go away. I think a lot of effort is going to be put into resolving it, and it is not something that we're happy with. So by all means, I think if you want to ask the Scrutiny Commission to look at it, or the Scrutiny Commissioners, they will pick that up. Okay, so my next...
I don't think you need to go to the Scrutiny... Sorry, Charles, because I don't think you need to go to the Scrutiny Commission. Perhaps to the director, copying in Simon and Lauren, just so they can see what I'm doing.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah, I'm happy with that.
Yeah, I'll do that then. Thank you.
So I've got Bill Bolter next, if you would like to ask.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yes, rather disappointing. If you cast your mind back 2 or 3 years, we complained about the number of complaints we had against the council, the Ombudsman's reports, and we strengthened the department so this didn't happen in the future. But it doesn't seem to have worked. We've still got more complaints than we had before, and the amount of money we're paying out is greater. And then we see reports like we saw in last night's Leicester Mercury, which is a difficult situation, I've no doubt, but I can't understand why complaints aren't handled in the amount of time that's supposed to be handled in, or not answer the phone or answer emails. It doesn't seem logical to me that all these people in the departments can't answer emails or answer a phone call and nip some of these in the bud before we get this far. It doesn't seem, logical to me that we let things go for all these days over the time we know we're supposed to act on, and yet nobody takes any action, or it appears nobody takes any action.
I will ask. I mean, I will ask Simon to comment, but I think I would hope that every effort is made, and of course the complexity and time required to investigate to be able to reply sometimes takes longer. But I would have thought of holding a reply pending investigation, but I'll be guided by Simon. Simon, could you comment on that?
Yeah, so I'm assuming that the timeliness is relating to resolving them before they enter the complaints territory. I've probably taken from that. In terms of when they actually in the complaints territory, the response times as set out in the report are fairly good and very low levels outside of our policy timescales. But I take the point that it's probably more about the wider nipping this in the bud before it enters the formal complaints territory. I guess the thing to say on that is there's lots of work going on in different departments, and some areas have probably seen more success than others at different points. If I go back 2 or 3 years ago, we used to have no end of problems, for example, around timeliness of responses to inquiries around drainage, traffic calming. We rarely see those now, and those processes really improved. Other areas are perhaps seeing more signs of pressure, and I think the SEN ones are, it's fair to say, there is a running theme around that, around timeliness of communication within there. There's lots of additional capacity has gone in through this year, but obviously that's probably only starting to materialise in the latter half of the year, stroke into this year, that the benefits from that. So inevitably these things take some time to filter through, but it's fair to say that there was resourcing pressures there. That action has been taken. I do know that from the responses and my conversations with the assistant director and director in children and family services around that, and there remain, as Lauren's indicated, a lot of other more systemic improvements, whether that be the systems, the case recording systems, some of those processes around linkages with other teams that are also being heavily worked on. So you're right, it is disappointing whenever that there are opportunities to miss resolving complaints at an early stage, and I continue to work hard with services to try and encourage that good practice. And as I say, there are particularly where there's themes that emerge through my complaints intelligence. Those are fed back through quarterly attendance at the various departments and their senior leadership teams to get on the front foot with fixing some of those problem areas.
Thank you very much, Simon. I think it's a good point made by Bill Bolter. The reality is preventing it going to complaint, and the time it takes to resolve the complaint is best avoided if we can. And I think Simon is probably more aware than we are that that's the case. So the next question.
Can I ask one more question, please, Chair?
Of course you can. Of course you can.
Well, Lauren, I suppose, really. It says in the report, we don't have to carry out the Ombudsman's recommendations. Tried that, came unstuck on that one. The case in question, the Ombudsman looked at a case which is outside the timescale for him to look at. He still looked at it and still found against the council, which was pointed out to him, and he didn't take any notice of that. So the only way to overturn our decision is a JR, no other course of action. Well, when you start going to courts to overturn Ombudsman's report, you're talking a considerable amount of money. So it might be true, you don't carry out their recommendations, but you face a penalty if you don't. Any comments from Lauren on that one?
You're muted, Lauren.
Sorry, I'm muted. Sorry. Yeah, you're right. It's a very blunt tool, JR. It's costly. It takes a long time, and it's not about a challenge on whether the decision's right or wrong. You've got to show that the Ombudsman's irrational, and that's really going to be very tricky to do. So really, you are in quite a difficult place. If you don't accept the findings, the option is JR. You don't have to implement all of the recommendations, but then somebody who's dissatisfied by that, a complainant who's not happy because you haven't done what the Ombudsman says you should do, can challenge you, and it's quite difficult to defend that. I think the better course, if you can, is to negotiate really with the Ombudsman to set out what you've done and why, and where the Ombudsman has made a recommendation that's not workable, not reasonable, not practicable, too costly, whatever it may be. I think the important bit is to set out clearly why the authority is not complying with it, and enter a dialogue with the Ombudsman and try and agree a more workable solution. But really, we're in a difficult place with these cases because we have to act fairly and reasonably, and that means really we have to accept what the Ombudsman says. Obviously we contribute heavily when the investigation is ongoing. We put robust cases on behalf of the council where we think we've acted properly, and the Ombudsman is taking a different approach. We challenge that. But in the end, unless the Ombudsman's decision can be plainly described as irrational in the sense of being completely, utterly unreasonable, and one that no reasonable decision maker would have reached, the council is stuck with it, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Lauren. I mean, actually, I thought I read that we had 100% compliance with the Ombudsman in 1920. I mean, there may have been outside financial settlement, but we did actually get 100% compliance, which was good. And there are areas we've discussed, and they are clearly understood, and we're working to resolve them. The next question is from Ivan Old. If I could invite Ivan to ask his question.
It isn't a question, Chair. It's a couple of observations.
Yep.
In respect of Sean's inquiry, my understanding is that Ofsted have accepted the response report without qualification, which is quite an unusual event. And members of this committee need to be reassured that there are regular meetings involving representatives of the Leicestershire Parents Forum. Having said that, there is sometimes a mismatch between parents who want very expensive private education for their child and the local authority acting in the best use of its own resources, nominating one of its own schools or an adjacent school. And that is quite an intractable situation. Now, if you go back in history, this all emanated from the 1914 Act. For the first 2 years, it's fair to say, there was a decrease, and then suddenly there was an increase. And the increase has come about because there are now firms who advertise to help parents to get what they want and are prepared to take local authorities to task over it. Leicestershire is actually in a very good place. It's got an expansion programme for special educational needs. And as I say, as far as I'm aware, the Ofsted response report, which I didn't sign off, I was no longer a cabinet member then, has been accepted.
Thank you, Ivan. I think that brings, well, thank you very much for that contribution. I think that does give some reassurance. Now, I cannot see that we have got any other questions. So as far as this is concerned, the committee is recommended to note the contents of this report, and I think to provide the comment and feedback on the Ombudsman annual review letter and complaints and freedom of information handling arrangements and improvement as outlined. I think there is enough information that's been said to go into the minutes as a comment, but there are some, it has been a difficult time, and I know there is no excuse. It's really difficult. Right, so can I take the report as noted, and members agree that all comments made will be captured in the minutes in the usual way? I take that as agreed. Is everybody happy with that? Yep. Thank you. Thanks very much. So we now move on to item 10, which is the resilience and business continuity update as set out on pages 119 to 124 of the agenda pack. We have Zafar Salam, Head of Communications, Policy and Resilience, and Andrew Muir, Resilience and Business Continuity Manager, with us. And I will invite Zafar and Andrew to present their report.
Thank you, Chairman. Hopefully you can hear me clearly. Afternoon all. In terms of the report, hopefully it's relatively straightforward. Just a clarification on the timescale. Normally we submit the report annually in November. It was just there was a slight delay last financial year, so the report came in January 2020. So that shows that's the reason for some slight divergence in the report, in case councillors were concerned about the joining up of the timescales in paragraph 1 and paragraph 5 there. In terms of summary, I suppose it's reasonable to say it's been a very, very, very challenging time for everyone, and I think the word unprecedented is probably captures the situation accurately. There's been a series of ongoing, obviously, challenges. Some of them the committee's already heard about today, including the presentations on Brexit, and then some of the issues Neil raised in the risk register in terms of COVID responses. So, however, having said that, we've tried as best as we can to maintain business as usual, and what the report tries to do is capture some of the activity that's been ongoing since the last report was submitted. As a reminder, the council's certainly resilience responsibilities and business continuity responsibilities fall under the Civil Contingencies Act, and therefore it's a statutory requirement to make sure that there are plans in place and those plans are tested to make sure the council and the wider partnership can respond to major incidents, and our response is reasonably regularly audited externally, and we have through contacts we have at MHCLG, and we also test against best practice where we can through regional and national forums as well. At the moment, in terms of progress so far, a large amount of the team's activities has been focused on the COVID response, but what I hope to indicate is other areas as well where we've carried out work. If you look at paragraph 6 there, Chair, we've managed to maintain all the ongoing senior management responsibilities, and that's actually credit to all the heads of service and also the assistant directors and chief officers there. They, despite, as I said, the added pressures of services, we've managed to maintain the 24-hour call-out responsibilities. That allows us to support districts, environment agencies, the police, fire and rescue, etc., the city council, etc. If there is an incident anywhere within the county area. In terms of our actual planning process, how we develop plans and how we respond, then that's set out in section 7 there. There's an overall incident management plan, so that sets out the strategic direction. We have a requirement within our control mechanisms to make sure that that plan's tested at least annually and reviewed annually. I should say that all the plans, including the major incident plans, has been checked to make sure that we can respond to COVID. We have responded, so we can respond to EU exit as well, and we can respond to any other pressures. Beneath that, then there are a series of departmental and corporate plans. So there's a corporate business continuity plan, DMT plans, and then team business continuity plans as well. Those plans are checked. In particular, any service that's defined as a critical service, they have to ensure that there's a team business and service business continuity plan in place to make sure that we can cope if there are any staffing issues, ICT issues, for example, or perhaps externally there are some issues regarding suppliers. So we need to make sure those supply chains are in place and we have some continuity there, particularly, as I said, for adult social care, children's social care, environment and transport, and public health. And then finally, there's a flood and severe weather plan, which is a separate piece of work, which again is led primarily by our colleagues in E&T and in partnership with the Environment Agency. And again, that's tested regularly. We do, as you can see in paragraph 8 there, we try as well to support community groups with community response plans. The idea there is to adopt an asset-based approach, so we focus on what the community can do for itself. So we have increased the number of community plans over the year, and this is primarily working with parish and town councils. Obviously, there's more than 59 parish and town councils within the borough, so the aim is to increase that over a period of time and certainly get it over to well over 100. And we're reasonably confident we can do that because we've started and initiated a new piece of work, working with the voluntary sector, working with parish and town councils, working with public health, adult social care, and chief execs to try and put in some interventions that will support groups to help themselves. In addition, where we can provide funding. That's not always possible, but where we can get grants or use our own revenue funding, we try and do that. Paragraph 9 just basically sets out the approach to EU exit planning. I wasn't going to cover that in a huge amount of detail, although I'd be happy to take questions on that with my colleague Andrew, is because I know committees received a presentation from Tom Purnell, supported by Pat Clark on that, which hopefully answers any queries or questions councillors have. This year, in terms of incidents within the council and external to the council, is set out in paragraphs 10, 11 and 12 there. There's not been a significant number of internal issues within the council. Primarily, as you know, most staff have been operating out of County Hall since the middle of March. So there's certainly been no issues to do with the actual campus or the facilities there. Externally, there are incidents every month, and you can see there from January, February, March, April onwards. And as I said, they're variable from house fires to we needed to evacuate various places due to floods, for example. And I suspect these will continue into November, December, and then January, the winter months, in particular flooding and inclement weather. Looking forward, we have, briefly, I've just set out some ideas there for the way forward. I think the reality is this the second bullet point there, Chairman. We're going to probably have to focus on how we deal with multiple incidents or concurrent incidents over the winter period to at least March and April, I would think. The most pressing things are how we respond to supporting the NHS with the rollout of any vaccination programs, certainly mass vaccination programs, when that's formally launched by the government. I know there are some plans being developed at the moment, and then at some point we will be cited on those, and it'll be very clear what the expectations on the council are to support that process through the public health department, but also through working with the voluntary community sector as well. I expect also there to be possibly some flooding as well due to climate change and various other issues over the winter period. We've had a positive response in terms of the rollout of seasonal flu vaccinations and that, certainly in terms of take-up of our own staff. And I think also you would have, as I said earlier, you would have had a briefing from Tom and Pat on EU exit planning. Clearly, as we're talking as of today, that it's still to be determined whether there'll be a formal arrangement with the EU. And if there is, then obviously we'll deal with that. And if there isn't, then we'll obviously review our plans, in particular impact on certain services, such as adult social care, possibly the most, but also some of our supply chain and also our relationships with the voluntary sector and the business community. So that's the end of my report, Chairman. I'm happy to take any questions, should there be, and unless Andrew's got any comments he wants to make at this stage.
Andrew, is there any comments you would like to make?
No, I wouldn't hope to improve on the presentation that so far has just gone. Thank you.
That's fine. I mean, he did. To be honest, it seems to me, Zafar, as though you tested on a daily basis whether your resilience plan is in place, and particularly challenging over the last 12 months, and even more challenging over the next 12 months. So, some really valuable work being done, and a very comprehensive report. And thank you for your presentation. Now, I do have one question from Terry Richardson. If you could ask your question, please, Terry.
Thank you, Chair. I suppose this is the one report out of today's agenda I was slightly puzzled with, really, is about what it's telling us. So it's telling us we have a resilience plan, but I've got no idea from this whether it's successful or not. So, you know, if we take a couple of bits, so it's like paragraph 11, it says, you know, following these incidents, a regular update is provided to Resilience Planning Group. Well, do they do anything with it? Has anything happened? We then come down and we've got the schedule of work forward plan 2021. Well, there must have been a forward plan 1920, but there's no report on that forward plan in this report telling us what was achieved. So what I've got is a list of things that have happened, but I don't know what's happened with the list of things that have happened. So, for instance, you know, one of the things near my patch, not in my division, but nearby, we had some flooding in November in 2019, which still hasn't been resolved, still having ongoing dialogue on it. So surely the resilience plan should actually also cover how long it's going to take to solve some of these issues. Otherwise, a resilience plan can just be, well, we've got one, but it takes us 10 years to do, so that's fine. So I couldn't understand what we were measuring or how, as a committee, we can comment on whether or not this is a success or not. I've got no idea.
Okay.
So, you know, wasp infestation at Gretton Court, Melton, you go, cool. How quickly did we solve it? You know, if it took 6 months, it's not very good. If it took a week, it was fine. But I've got no idea.
All right. I'll ask Zafar or Andrew to comment on that. I mean, it's a comment, and the success of the resilience plan is based on the outcomes. And I suppose really what Mr. Richardson is asking, have we got any note of the outcomes, or could we give committee in future reports some reassurance that things are being actioned?
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Thank you, Mr. Richardson, for the comment and the observation. I think perhaps it would help committee, certainly in terms of future reports, that maybe we could put in some specific case studies that could deal with those questions. So, for example, you know, if there was we could pick out several incidents, for example, and then just say this was a response to that, and this was the resolution. In terms of the lessons learned, then after each incident, then there's a detailed debrief, and then there would be a plan to make sure that, as far as possible, there's no repetition of that. You know, obviously, in some cases, there's always going to be a repetition in terms of localized flooding. However, where we can do, then obviously colleagues in ENT will investigate the causes of that flooding, and where necessary, address that through measures. Andrew, I don't know whether in terms of you want to explain a little bit about the role of RPG and how they oversee what we do on a practical basis, and then take that back into the department, and similarly how some of that work through LLR Prepared takes place with the districts and the police and fire rescue.
Yes, certainly, and also the caveat that our plans are, or our incident response plan is a response plan. So very often in certain incidents, it's the facilitation of that onward solution by other agencies that our team deploy on. So this report indicates the amount of work that we have to do that may not be resolved by us as an organisation, but we might facilitate the police, fire, ambulance, or other agencies like the Environment Agency actually providing the solution to that. When we do have an incident, we report into Resilience Planning Group, as said, which is our oversight group, so that assistant directors and departments within the council have oversight of all the work that's being done and provide the guidance and control at a tactical and strategic level that we need to make sure we're going in the right direction. Of course, we are one authority out of 10 category 1 responders in local authorities that join in as part of the local resilience forum made up of the police, fire, ambulance as well. So it's that multi-agency working that we are a part of, which doesn't always provide us with an individual result, more that we're part of the greater good or the greater response across our multi-agency partners.
Thank you, Andrew. Terry, would you
come back on that one, just if I may? Yeah, but I understand that, but it's like, in paragraph 10 we got the 4 instance, and it says a regular update on all the instances provided to the resilience planning group. Now, this report is coming to elected members. In the resilience planning group, there are no elected members, as I understand it. So how do elected members satisfy themselves that something has come out of this and been dealt with properly? So if this is to report to corporate governance, how under corporate governance do we ascertain that we are doing things as well as practical and learning the lessons? Because that's a bit unclear.
Yeah, I think, thank you, Mr. Richardson. I think that's a fair point. As I said, if we will improve the report to give committee and councillors that assurance. As I said, probably the easiest way would be to dissect a number of those particular incidents, perhaps the more challenging ones, and then present them in a case study format or presentation format, setting out exactly what the problem was, what the intervention was put in place in terms of response, and then what the output and outcomes were. Where there are time limits, response levels, then obviously we can put those in as well. So that's normally how we can do that relatively easily, Chairman.
All right, thank you, and I think we'll look forward to that. I think Mr. Richardson's made a point about he'd just like seeing some outcomes, and it is a fair comment, as you say, Zafar. Thank you both very much for your report. Now, the committee is asked to note this report. Can I take it as noted? I take that as everybody's agreed. So we now move on to the item 11, quarterly Treasury and Management Report, as set out on pages 125 to 142 of the agenda pack. Nick Walsh, Head of Finance, will present this item. So if I could over to you, please, Nick.
Yeah, thank you again, Chairman. This is the report for the second quarter, and it sort of follows a sort of well tried and tested format that members will be familiar with. The usual economic assessment by link, the Council's Treasury Management Advisors, is attached as Appendix A. The key points from their assessment are included in paragraphs 7 to 10. I think it is important to note, though, that sort of recent positive announcements in relation to COVID vaccinations and their high efficacy rates are likely to have an impact on the outcomes of their forward sort of projections as such, as would sort of, the US presidential elections. All of these things have happened will have an impact on the kind of the economic prospects going forwards, and they're not necessarily reflected in the report that Link have provided at this stage. Obviously, also of key importance is that whilst interest rates are expected to remain very low in the short term, negative interest rates, the sort of spectrum of negative interest rates, does seem to have gone away a little bit, which is perhaps reassuring, although obviously we can't rule it out completely as something that is going to happen. So moving on to sort of paragraphs 12 to 16 of the report, these reflect on the recent downgrade in the UK sovereign rating. There's more information included in that in Appendix B, but as a result of this, 6 out of the UK's banks have now been downgraded by Moody's, perhaps not unexpected, and is solely as a result of the overall UK sovereignty rating, rather than any direct reflection on the banks themselves. But it is also worth noting that the other 2 credit rating agencies that are used by Link, Fitch and Standard & Poor, they didn't downgrade. Obviously, though, with COVID-19, it is in all likelihood going to impact on banks' profitability and the quality of their asset holdings as we go forwards. So it's quite possible that there will be further downgrades by the credit rating agencies over the next year or so. and that would mean that our investment options that are already becoming limited may further reduce.
Yep.
Moving on to sort of actions during this last quarter, we had 115 million pounds worth of loans matured, and they had an average rate of 0.66%. And in the same period, we've taken out 150 million pounds of new ones, which were placed at an average rate of 0.34%. So obviously, average rates achieved is continuing to fall as interest rates remain low. The average annual percentage rate across the portfolio as a whole has reduced from 0.81% in Q1 to 0.69% in Q2. And inevitably, this will continue to fall as current investments mature and then need to be invested at what will inevitably be lower interest rates. Just worth noting that the capital receipt of 0.9 million from the private debt portfolio was welcome, though, and has been good news. Moving on to the table in paragraph 20, what that shows is that the balance of the investment portfolio totals 273.3 million. There are a number of banks that are highlighted in grey on the table, and these are ones where at the end of Q2 we were sort of maxed out in terms of the lending limits recommended by Link, so we couldn't put any more their way. And since the end of Q2, it's probably worth noting also that in the current quarter we are now also at capacity with Australia and New Zealand Bank. So the impact of these ratings actions and the downgrading of some institutions, coupled with the sort of regulatory change which has increased the required levels of capitalisation that banks need to hold, coupled with again low demand for money as a result of the various fiscal and monetary stimulus measures that the government have put in place, means that demand for cash is very, very low at the moment, as low as it's ever really been. The money market funds, which obviously we have recently started using again, are currently paying very low rates of return, between 0.01% and 0.05%. And then another option that's open to us, the debt management office, debt management office for short-term deposits are in negative interest rate territory, so we're not keen to go there. Link continues to advocate the use of lending to other local authorities as very low risk. We don't currently do this, and actually at the moment demand from other local authorities is low, again I guess due to the significant funds made available to local authorities in the current year, but a lot of which has perhaps been made in advance of the actual need to spend. However, as we kind of progress through the rest of this financial year and we get to the end of this year, it's probably expected that many authorities will find themselves short of cash, basically, to see them through into the next financial year. And then in this scenario, it's likely that interest rates paid by these authorities is likely to increase. It is important to note, obviously, that lending to other local authorities does incur that reputational risk if a counterparty goes public with financial difficulties, and we did experience that when we lent to Northamptonshire. The perception would be that it would be a risky loan, even though in reality the risks are pretty much non-existent, given that local authorities have a zero historic default rate. So some of this reputational risk can be minimised by doing some appropriate due diligence before such a loan is made. So as such, sort of opportunities will be considered should they sort of look attractive and some comfort be achieved that reputational risk is low as we move forward in the remaining of this financial year and into the next financial year.
Okay.
Then just going down to paragraph 31, I just need to draw committee's attention to the fact that following the Moody's downgrade, Link reduced the suggested lending period for Lloyds Bank from 12 months down to 6 months. And at the end of the Q2, we did have 40 million of exposure with Lloyds, as you can see from the table in paragraph 20. But 20 million of that doesn't mature until September 21. Meaning it's now outside of the authorised sort of lending duration. Obviously, there's not anything we can do about it because at the time we made the loan, the 12 months was still recommended as a suitable loan period for Lloyds. But it's just for committee to note. And then finally, just in terms of paragraph 32, The estimated level of interest that we can receive on our investments in the current year is anticipated to be around 1.1 million, which is up from the Q1 estimate, primarily just because our expected cash balances have been a little bit higher, arising from slippage in the capital programme, and also the kind of overall review of the capital programme that we've undertaken, which has reduced some of the in-year spend. Of course, that 1.1 million is still well below the budgeted figure of 2.8 million, though, that we set at the start of the year. So thank you, Chairman. That was all I wanted to say. So happy to take any questions.
Yeah, thanks very much. That's a very comprehensive report, and appreciate the difficulties you face in getting the income as you predicted in the budget. Now, I have a question from, if I could ask him forward, and if anybody hasn't got their microphone muted, if they would, because we're getting quite a bit of feedback. Okay, thank you. Sean.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, a couple of things I'm intrigued about here. Paragraph 20, the Partners Group private debt 18.5 estimated repayment 2024. It does stand out a little bit from the banks, and I wonder what's different about that and what exactly we're taking on in terms of risk with that. The second question is paragraph 26. Page 129. We know, we've been told many times that other local authorities couldn't really go bankrupt or become insolvent, but there's a line at the end of that paragraph which says that the default did occur, courts can order council tax be collected to repay outstanding loans. Now, I'd have thought if a local authority got into that much trouble, the government would step in. But this appears to suggest that there is a possibility, however remote, they might have to levy a supplementary charge on local council taxpayers, and I can't imagine that going down too well. Could you explain that one?
Yeah, so picking up on that point first then, it's obviously highly unlikely that it would ever get to that position in the first place. And I guess it's a measure that exists that a local authority could be expected to raise that additional council tax should it didn't need to repay an outstanding loan that it couldn't do from any other sort of position. But I suspect you might be right that before we got to that point, there would be some kind of mitigation that would be put in place. The government would do something in the background to avoid that actually eventuality occurring. So I suspect the risk of that actually happening is very low. Okay. In terms of the private debt investments, this was a decision that was taken a few years back now, where as part of sort of diversifying our portfolio around the sort of corporate asset investment fund more widely, that we would put some investment, and at the moment it's up to 25 million into private debt funds, and so that's the level of investment there. But the way that the money comes back from that is very sporadic, and we're still kind of fairly early in the process to sort of know exactly how well it will pay back relative to the scale of other investments. For example, investments we might make in property portfolio, for example. But as part of, as the property markets are always a little bit volatile, it was felt a good way of actually diversifying our portfolio to invest in this private debt. And we do it through various groups that take on this private debt and then collect it, and we get returns periodically on the back of that. So it is considered to be pretty low risk, and when we took it on, that was one of the bases in which it was agreed by Cabinet that we would make that investment. But as I say, it's still relatively early days in terms of our investment, because it's only really last financial year really where we actually probably did much of this investment. It was agreed at the back end of the previous financial year. So it's still early days, and we don't expect there to be a kind of regular return on it. It will only sort of emerge over time.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much, Nick.
Thank you, Chair.
I have I have left to Chris Tambini would like to ask a question. Please, Chris, come in with your question.
Yeah, I wasn't going to ask a question. I was just going to add a bit more to Mr. Sheehan's kind of private debt kind of question. What we did with this one, we kind of piggybacked on some pension fund due diligence in terms of the partners group, who are kind of one of our mandates we invest in through the pension fund. It is low risk. It is I suppose there's a basket of kind of smaller loans to a number of different companies, and most of those loans will be secured on property or secured on something else. So we're not expecting any defaults. The interest rate isn't that high that we get from them, 4 or 5%, to reflect the fact they are kind of low risk loans. So it was, as Nick said, just to diversify the portfolio and actually to try and get a little bit more return in terms of the return on some of our cash balances, clearly given the very, very low returns we're getting elsewhere.
Thank you, Chris. No, I can't see any other questions, so the committee is asked to note this report. Can I take it as noted? I'll take that as agreed. We now move on to item 12, update on the developments in the local external audit arrangements as set out on pages 143 to 156 of the agenda pack. Neil Jones is going to present this item. If I could, over to you, Neil.
Thank you, Chair. I think John Gregory's still on the call, so with your permission, at the end of my presentation, I might ask John to just give us his take on what I'm about to report. Yep. So this is a follow-up report to one about a year ago now, which I took to committee, explaining about the onset of a number of consultation reviews. The previous one also contains some governance-related topics. This one particularly focuses on local audit arrangements. So I'm just calling up my presentation now to myself, and I just wanted to start before I go into it. A couple of caveats, really, or a couple of important things to remind people. This is primarily a report of the facts of the current information. So I've not put any sort of personal slants into my views on this. Secondly, the concerns raised, particularly in the Redmond review, don't necessarily apply to the council's relationship with its own local auditor. So just start with those at the outset. So a bit of background in that. They were based on a number of corporate governance and financial failings in both the private sector, for example, Carillion and BHS, and the public sector in terms of Northamptonshire, and certain criticisms of the roles taken by the auditors of those organisations. These led to a number of reviews. Already ongoing at the time were the regulation and practices of audit firms, and that led to 3 reviews. So you've got the Kingman, Competition Market Authority, and the Bryden reviews. Then in terms of local authorities, the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government, it was coming up to 5 years' time after the introduction of the Local Audit and Accountability Act in 2014. So we thought it was an appropriate time to review the audit framework and financial reporting elements, and that it led on to the Redmond review by Sir Tony Redmond, and that review also took account of the outcomes of the 3 previous reviews I referred to. In terms of the National Audit Office, they review their annual Code of Audit Practice every 5 years. And basically, the Redmond review and the Code of Audit Practice review pretty much ran in tandem. But both of them were set out on a journey of improving local auditing system and financial transparency and accountability. In terms of Redmond, the principles behind his review were, does the system provide accountability and transparency? It was a very large scale and wide ranging review, over 160 responses and 100 plus interviews. The report came out on the 8th of September. That was 86 pages, and there was 19 recommendations in relation to the large local authorities. Key findings and concerns, and I will reiterate, this may not be applicable to the County Council. Overall, Redmond determined there was a lack of coherence and public accountability in the system. 6 different entities were involved in the system, and there wasn't one that had an oversight. The concerns over the audit price and quality in terms of price fee quality, and also, and again, I stress this, beyond the key audit partners, There was concerns around whether audit firm staff had sufficient experience and knowledge of local authorities. There was a large expectation gap on what the value for money opinion actually provides. You'd have heard that mentioned earlier on today in John's presentation. And there was reference to not utilising internal auditors perhaps much could. There are reasons for that, which I'll come on to probably. In terms of local authority governance, and specifically the role for this committee, in terms of it being an audit committee, do they have the capacity and facility to effectively challenge its officers? And is there any benefit in bringing independent members into the committee? There was a need for a better measurement of financial resilience. That led into more work on the value for money opinion, and that the statutory accounts were deemed complex and challenging, and there was a need to improve the transparency of local authorities in that. Overall conclusion from Redmond was that the arrangements failed to deliver the 2014 Act objectives. What did he recommend? He came up with recommendations in three aspects: the regulation of the audit market, the financial resilience of local authorities, and financial reporting. There's going to be required some primary legislation for some of his recommendations. For instance, he's creating a new regulatory body and liaison committee, and then also including in that with a suggestion to change the audit completion deadline. So that will take some primary legislation. However, there are localised recommendations, for example, looking at the benefits of independent members on an audit committee, and looking at the auditor taking a report beyond the Corporate Governance Committee through to full council. Overall, there's been much support for the review and its outcomes, including from the firms and the housing communities and local government. Redland is widely promoting that his proposals would improve broken LA audit system, whilst improving financial transparency. Just a reminder, ultimately, I brought this paper to keep members informed of progress, but then I think what we'll need to do is form a more defined plan amongst officers and members to evaluate certainly the localised recommendations, and I'd expect colleagues from legal, finance and democratic support on that. So that's Redmond. Just briefly onto the National Audit Office Code of Audit Practice Review. And the local auditors have to have regard to the Code of Audit Practice and Auditor Guidance Notes, called AGNs. And statute requires that a review of the Code of Audit Practice takes place every 5 years, and this coincidentally ended up in a new code being published in April 2020. The consultation on the guidance notes to implement that code has just concluded, and there was strong support from across the industry. There's some key changes, and I think one of the things that will need to come out of this is some further guidance and training to Corporate Governance Committee members. The key changes include greater emphasis on timely and effective reporting. There's a new annual report that will be produced by the local auditor. In its work on value for money, there is allowance now for tailored commentaries to be made in the areas of financial resilience, governance and value for money. And so that will enable the local auditor to make it more local, as it says, and determine more words around how they've reached that opinion. There may be some help and overlap there with the governance work that internal audit does. There is some risks behind that, in so much that by making those commentaries, it may require greater audit resource and a higher skill mix. The guidance note that supports this is AGN 03, and this is a guidance for the auditor in determining their work on value for money. And within that, there is guidance on how to define weaknesses, which has been supported. For the first time, or I consider for the first time, not found it before, there are 2 new specific references to the roles of audit committees. One is a positive, one's a negative. And in the positive one, that if in the governance arrangements of the organisation, under their proper arrangements, if an audit committee is providing an effective challenge, then that is seen as a proper arrangement. Nevertheless, on the negative side, should an audit committee fail to appropriately challenge or hold officers and members to account, that could be seen as a significant weakness in governance arrangements. Obviously, with the introduction of the new code, county council officers and members will need to liaise on the new arrangements and, as I say, get some new training. Briefly onto the other reviews I mentioned earlier on, only to say that Redmond took account of the findings within those and the recommendations and aligned them to his. There was one area of particular concern in the Bryden review, which recommended the creation of a specific audit profession, and Redmond saw that might impact the sustainable resource for local authority audits, and it might push auditors into a private sector profession rather than staying within the public sector. So in conclusion, and the next steps, considerable in-depth attention has been focused on the audit system over the last couple of years with the intention of improving the processes and establishing greater accountability and transparency. I think the impacts on the County Council of Redmond and the new Code of Audit Practice could be profound, and I think further reports will need to be brought to the Corporate Governance Committee as required. I'll gladly take any questions or take any views, as I say, from John, maybe Chris, or even Lauren. Thank you.
So I just wonder if John is still on the call, if he's got any, John Gregory's got any anything he'd like to add to it.
Yes, certainly. Just briefly, thank you, Chair. Yeah, I mean, just to start off by saying thanks to Neil for acknowledging that not all of the criticisms of the system mentioned in the Redmond review apply to ourselves, and in particular, we do take great pride within Grant Thornton of actually using specialist staff who do actually know the public sector well, and hopefully that is reflected. I think just to mention the new code. I mean, Neil's absolutely right that the change in the value for money conclusion approach is the most fundamental thing. So we're moving away completely from this idea of giving a value for money conclusion that is either qualified or unqualified, and we are replacing that very blunt tool with a sort of more nuanced narrative approach. And the idea as well is that the reporting of the work we do on value for money and that sort of narrative report is what will appear in what's called our annual auditor's report, which is going to replace the old annual audit letter. So you will no longer get VFM work reported in the audit findings report in the way it is at the moment. Turning to Redmond, I mean, all of us, I think, who are involved in the regime at the moment, absolutely support the need to bring things back together again, because the way that we are currently regulated and held to account is incredibly fragmented and badly needs changing. That said, the unfortunate thing is that will need primary legislation to do it, and we are increasingly sceptical about the government's commitment and the sheer practicalities of the legislative time to implement that, given other priorities that the government rightly has at the moment. But we do think it needs fixing. We recognise a lot of what the Redmond report says, and hopefully we look forward to working with you to implement those things which can, are kind of within our gift really to implement without waiting for primary legislation.
Okay, that's reassuring. Thank you, John. There's a hell of a lot in the Redmond report. I have one question from Sean Sheehan.
Yes, Neil, you said you were going to refrain from expressing your own views here. I wonder if I can help a little bit with that. Maybe give you an invitation to expand a little bit on how you think about this. Does the audit system really need this kind of overhaul, or are we paying for somebody else's misdeeds?
I think Neil.
I heard, yeah, it was very difficult to hear.
Oh, great.
Did you want me to repeat anything?
Yeah, I think it was whether the findings of Redmond report are real, relevant, and is it are we just being penalised for the failings of other councils? I think you've covered a lot, but I think, Mr. Sheen, we just want some reassurance that it's not over the top and that there really is some relevance to it.
Yes, sorry. Yes, I think John alluded to that. By his recognition as a member of an audit firm, that some of the criticisms are real, but they may not. We may not be caught up in the level of the detail, but certainly there's a lot of fragmentation, as John said, that needs to be brought back to more focus. And I think the key area for me is I think most Section 151s, I know Chris is still here to answer this, but when they go through, and all chief officers really, when the value for money opinion is reached, that is a real indication of an authority's worth and sustainability. And I think the emphasis being added into that in the Code of Audit Practice and picked up by Redmond will really benefit an organisation such as our own.
Okay, thank you. I have two more questions or statements from Terry Richardson. If you could ask your question.
Thanks, Chair. No, I found this very interesting. I mean, the implications of the Redmond report, I think, are huge, personally. Because what he's effectively saying, if I've understood it correctly, and I'm sure John can correct me if I don't, is that there needs to be far more due diligence done by councillors on the financial paperwork. So as a corporate governance committee, we don't actually particularly look at accounts in any great detail at any time during the year apart from budget time. And I think what Redmond is recommending, particularly under figure 7.2 of his report, is that has got to be done. I think where he's missing the plot completely, although he does allude to it, is that because local government accounting is so damn complicated, and he himself says our accounting procedures are even worse than central government, which is, when you think what they spend compared to us, is staggering. He misses the point that if we actually run the council as a business and we just did normal accounting, got rid of SIPFA, the whole thing would be sensible. But I do believe the implication of this is that corporate governance, if I've read this interpreted correctly in its current format, wouldn't be able to continue. You need a corporate governance committee to do everything but the financial side, and you need an audit committee who did nothing else but look at the financial side of it. Would strike me as the implications of the report. I mean, I appreciate it goes to 72 pages, and I won't say I've read every word in detail, but that's my understanding, because it's up to the councillors then. So if we go back to the Croydon situation, as I understand it, I mean, they got in difficulty because they lent 200 million to their own building company, never collected a penny back from them, not even any income to pay the interest on what they borrowed, which is why they've gone bust. Now, clearly that's not been picked up in the audit for the previous 5 years, saying they're about to go bust if they don't get any money back. And clearly, what were members doing at Croydon if they hadn't seen that information? So I suppose that's where he's coming from. But I do think there are massive implications here if this goes through as it is, personally.
Yeah, thanks, Terry. I absolutely agree with you. I think the implications here really significant and far-reaching and deep. John, could I ask you to comment, bring it all your questions?
Yes, indeed. I mean, I was just going to pick up on the sort of how much is it broken question from Mr. Sheehan initially, but I can pick up on Mr. Richardson's comment as well. I mean, to my mind, the thing that needs addressing most urgently is probably around the sort of the fact that the market for the provision of external audit to local government is essentially broken, because fees have actually been pushed too low, and at the same time we are subject to increased regulatory pressure, which you'll know from previous discussions we've had around around the need for increases in fees, and basically because of the higher level of risk now attached to the work and the poor returns that can be made from it, a number of firms are looking at whether they actually want to continue in this sector, and it's already a sector which is very heavily dominated by a very small number of firms. And I say that as we in Grant Thornton have the audits of 40% of local authorities. They have tried to encourage other firms to enter the market, but there's no way that's going to happen under the current sort of risk versus rewards balance. And I think if other firms decide that they don't want to continue in this market, then there is a serious problem. It's a problem that is already apparent in the NHS, where bodies actually appoint their own auditors, but the same sort of pressures apply. And there are now a number of NHS bodies who have been struggling to get anybody to bid for their audits, and that's just not a sustainable position. So that's probably the most immediate thing that needs to be addressed. But I mean, to go on to Mr. Richardson's point, yes, absolutely, it is fundamental. It is about increased, I guess you'd call it financial governance. I mean, I'm not sure that it's about separating finance off from corporate governance. It's about making sure that your corporate governance arrangements effectively consider the financial position. Absolutely agree that the accounts need simplifying. I was thinking that earlier on when I was explaining about the emphasis of matter and talking about the reader of the accounts. Well, I don't suppose there are too many readers of the accounts at the moment, because they really don't want to be bothered reading a 200-page document. Now, actually, yours isn't quite as bad as some, but plenty of them do run to 200 pages. And some of the ways the accounting works, well, it's unique to local government, and it's all about trying to avoid impacts on local council taxpayers from applying sort of standard accounting practice, and trying to get that properly understood, and the amount of time that goes into auditing that just isn't sensible. So, as you might gather, I'm a bit of an advocate for what Mr. Redmond had to say.
Yeah, thanks, John. I've got Chris Tambini would like to make a statement or comment. Chris, please.
Yeah, it's just a comment, Chair, really, because I mean, I think I've already said it. They are big fundamental changes, but they are needed. I must admit, from my perspective, there's a massive long list now of authorities who have failed: Northants, Croydon, then you've got the likes of Nottingham and Warrington, and there's a whole host of them. And I'm sure by the time this has run its course, there's going to be an awful lot more. And it's not just the audit regime. I mean, it is kind of wider governance. So you can talk about incomprehensible accounting, and I kind of agree that if you're trying to read a set of local government accounts is really difficult. But even actually reading, I don't know, the budget monitoring reports. And if you do go on to some websites and you look at those authorities that have had difficulties and try and look at their reports they write for members, which are supposed to kind of be making the accounts made easy, they are kind of incomprehensible. So I think it's a much kind of wider issue than just the audit. And this goes some way, but I kind of think there's a bit more of a way to go. And I wouldn't advocate in any way kind of going back to the Audit Commission, because I think that was kind of too much. But whether this really does go far enough, I'm not 100% certain. And I kind of think there'll be a few more failures over the next year. We'll have to see kind of what the response is to that, because I think it is a big issue, the financial sustainability of local government. I mean, I used to work for PwC going back 20 years, when I used to audit local authorities. And actually, some of the stuff that's in the Redmond Review is what we used to do I'm sure it used to be used to assess the financial standing of local authorities rather than the value for money. So I think we are kind of going a bit full circle. But I say I'm not sure whether this really does quite go far enough. We'll have to wait and see.
Thanks, Chris. I think it just confirms what John said, Terry said. There are fundamental changes coming, and one of them is councillors being able to understand and comprehend what is going on and make a critical challenge where necessary. And that you're quite right. If it's brought to the attention of councillors, they should be challenging it if there is something fundamentally wrong before a council goes bust. Thank you. Terry, have you got another question? Terry, have you got another question?
Yeah, it was only I just wanted to come back in on the point John made. When I said about splitting corporate governance, I didn't mean it, it was logical. What I was referring to was the implications are the amount of work involved for a committee.
Absolutely, yeah.
Looking through the accounts would deem it almost impossible for something like the Corporate Governance Committee to spend time looking at the financial aspects as well as all the other aspects and do them all justice. So my only point was to make implications for potentially the work of members going forward, were these reviews to be taken on board as is suggested going forward. So it was just to, and I think you covered that, John, in the amount of increased work potentially there could be in there for both auditors and members and officers at the council to actually meet all the criteria in the Redmond report.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Terry. So I think I've got Bill Bolt who wants to ask a question. Bill, if you could come in.
Yes, certainly, Chair. Yes, it seems to me that we are going back to the old Audit Commission. That was abolished because the cost was so great, and it was put into the private sector to reduce the costs. Now we seem to be going back to the same thing. Wow. So another 25% possible increase in the costs. How's that sustainable with local authorities? Because, it's a cost that we can't get away from. We're told that's what we've got to pay. It doesn't seem right to me that we can't negotiate our own deals.
Okay, thank you. I'll ask Neil to come in now. You're muted, Neil. Still muted.
Sorry, Mr. Bolter. It's not in response to your question. It was just going back to Mr. Richardson's point about the role of the Audit Committee, really, or the Corporate Governance Committee in challenging this. I think that's the previous report I covered with the National Audit Office guide. They see the real importance of audit committees in terms of being able to have the tools and the confidence to challenge. And I think we're going to not only those, but CIPFA's audit arm, they are promoting a lot of guidance for audit committees. So I think everybody's recognising what a good route of challenge would be, and then they're starting to provide the tools. So we'll, as well as training events, we'll push as many as those to you, so that the questions are already there for you to ask, if you like, sort of thing. So it gives you that little bit of confidence.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Neil. I think that's very helpful. Certainly, probably one of the most significant reports come through here for a long time. The committee is asked to note the report, including the outcomes of the Redmond review, the new code of audit practice and other developments in local external audit arrangements. And we've had a good discussion on that. Can I take it as noted? I take that as everyone is agreed. Yeah. Okay, so the final report we've got is we now have the internal audit progress report as set out on pages 157 to 176. Again, Neil, it's over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Won't keep long on this. This is the day job. This is the internal audit service. So work that we've concluded over the last time we reported, which was back in July. pretty much a standard report. There's been a lot of emphasis over the period of time, though, in grants auditing, which is relatively new. Usually the county council only audits a few grants, but we've had a lot of government grants targeted towards COVID. So that requires my staff to gather information and then me to sign off, mostly in conjunction with the chief exec, that we've utilised that grant properly. So that's a change in emphasis. Also, in the work that we have, our sort of training and development work, I've already mentioned obviously the work that we've done counter fraud on COVID counter fraud, and also there's been a lot of development of our remote working and technological improvements. So that's what we've been doing over the quarter, and then we also, as you know, our work may determine high importance recommendations, so we keep on top of those, bring them back to the committee. You can imagine there was a little bit of a hiatus with the crisis time, where we eased back off management in chasing those and extended out the dates, which was a sensible thing to do. In terms of reporting now, as things, I use the word stabilise, slightly, I'm hoping it's going to be more stable. We have managed to close off some of those recommendations, which is good. We've added a couple new to the list, which we'll keep on targeting, and then there's some that we've just extended out the date. So it's a fairly tame report in terms of just explaining the work that we do to provide assurance on the control environment. Willing to take any questions.
Yep. I think it's a fairly clear report. I cannot see that anyone has any questions.
Excuse me, Chair, I got my hand up.
Oh, have you? Sorry, Bill. For some unknown reason, it's not showing on my. But carry on.
Yeah. Just a couple of things. I understand people working from home can claim £7 a week. Did the county council pay people £7 a week extra for working from home? And the second one is direct payments. Has the guidance been reissued for direct payments? It was going to be reissued. If you remember last meeting, they said they were going to reissue the guidance. So I'm just checking to make sure it has been reissued for direct payments.
First, the answer to the £7, we're encouraged to claim it through our tax. Is that correct, Chris? Chris Tombini, if you can confirm that.
Yeah, I was about to come in. Yeah, that's it. It's a tax claim. So the guidance has gone out to all members of staff that they can claim it.
Okay.
The second one?
The direct payments. This is in relation to the high importance recommendations, is it, Mr.
Yes.
So I'm just scrolling down to confirm when we actually reported that. Just bear with me 1 second. I think it's new that's gone out this meeting, hasn't it? So hang on, I'll get there in a second. You're ahead of me. Yeah. So we wouldn't expect. We've set a date for that. When the work was concluded, we set a date for us to go back so that the actions would be completed by the end of December. So we're not quite there yet. I will ask after this committee, though, in terms of if anything has gone out, and if so, let the committee know in advance of that rather than wait until January.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I cannot see any more questions now. So we are asked to note the report, that the contents report. Can I take it as noted? I can't see any dissent there, so I take that as agreed. Now, that is the final item. The future meeting, the next one is on the Friday, the 29th of January at 10 o'clock. I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank all officers, and John Gregory and Neil Jones in particular, for we've given him held his feet to the fire fairly firmly this afternoon, and he's not been found wanting. But thanks all members and all officers for their input, and that concludes today's meeting of the Corporate Governance Committee. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.